The Great Anteater. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Great Anteater from Heads and Tails, compiled by Adam White. Myrmecophaga jubata. A few months ago, a handbill was distributed in the neighborhood of Seven Dials, inviting the public to visit a wonderful animal fed with ants and possessing strength to kill the lion, tiger, or any other animal under its claws. We entered the miserable apartment where it was exhibited, and any spectator must at once have been struck with the creature's want of resemblance to any other he had ever seen. Its head so small, so long and slender, the straight, wiry, dry hair with which it was covered, and its singularly large and bushy tail first attracted notice. A second glance showed its enormously thick forelegs, and the claws of its feet turned in, so that it walked on the sides of its soles. Oken and St. Hilaire would have said that it was all extremity. A cup, with the contents of 1 or 2 eggs, was brought, and it sucked them with great avidity, every now and then darting from its small mouth a very long tongue, which looked like a great black worm whisking about in the custard. One of its showmen told us that it had attacked the woman of the house the preceding day, and had scratched her arm. Whether this was true or grossly exaggerated, we know not, but if so, we suspect that the woman herself must have been in fault, and not the inoffensive stranger. On the payment of a handsome consideration to her owners, the poor captive was transferred from her unwholesome lodging in St. Giles to the gardens of the Zoological Society in the Regent's Park. And within the last few weeks her solitude has been cheered by the arrival of a companion from her native forests. The newcomer is in beautiful condition, though not nearly so large. He has a head decidedly shorter and stronger, and is probably not yet fully grown. The great anteater seems to be scattered over a wide extent of South America, Guyana, Brazil, and Paraguay being its places of abode. It is a stout animal, measuring from the end of the snout to the tip of the long tail 6 or 7 feet, of which the tail takes nearly the half, so that the actual size of its body is much reduced. In Paraguay it is named Nurumi or Yogui. The former name is altered from the native word for small mouth, and indicates a striking peculiarity in its structure. The Portuguese call it tamandua, the Spaniards ossa hormiguero, i.e. ant-hill bear. In Paraguay it prefers sides of lakes where ants, at least termites or white ants, are abundant, but it also frequents woods. In Guyana, Mr. Waterton found it chiefly in the inmost recesses of the forest, where it seems partial to the low and swampy parts near creeks, where the trolley tree grows. It sleeps a great deal, reclining on its side, as the visitor to the gardens may frequently see it do, with its head between its forelegs, joining its fore and hind feet, and spreading the tail so as to cover the whole body. Huddled up under this thatch, it might almost be taken for a bundle of coarse and badly dried hay. The tail is thickly covered with long hairs, placed vertically, the hairs draggling on the ground. When the creature is irritated, the tail is shaken straight and elevated. The natives of Paraguay, like any other persecutors of harmlessness, kill every specimen they meet, so that the anteater gets rare, and so rare it is on the Amazon that Mr. Wallace, who traveled there from 1848 to 1852, honestly tells us that he never saw one. He heard, however, that during rain it turns its bushy tail over its head and stands still. The Indians, knowing this habit, when they meet an anteater, make a rustling noise among the leaves. The creature instantly turns up its tail, and is easily killed by the stroke of a stick on its little head. The anteater is slow in its movements, never attempting to escape. When hard pressed it stops, and, seated on its hind legs, waits for the aggressor. Its object is to receive him between its forelegs, and one has only to look at its arms and claws in order to fancy what a frightful squeeze it would give. Nothing but death, they say, will make the creature relax its grasp. It is asserted that the jaguar, the tiger of South America and the most formidable beast of the New World, dares not attack it. This Azara, with good reason, doubts. A single bite from a jaguar, or the stroke of his paw, would fracture an anteater's skull before it had time to turn round, for the movements of this edentate quadruped are as sluggish as those of the toothed carnivorous tyrant are rapid. As seen in its handsome and roomy cage, the anteater gives us an impression of dullness and stupidity, and always smelling and listening and looking at the door where its keeper introduces its food. Its mind, when awake, appears to be constantly occupied about creature comforts. In the course of the day it laps up with its darting tongue, and sucks in through its long taper snout a dozen eggs, and almost the whole of a rabbit, chopped into a fine mincemeat. With such dainty fare, and with the anxious attention which it receives from its sagacious curators, it is scarcely surprising that it thrives; and when the warm weather comes, it will be a fine sight to see these animals enjoying the range of a paddock, which will doubtless be provided for their use, and exercising their brawny forelimbs and powerful claws in pulling down conical mounds, which may remind them of departed joys and balmier climes. Nor will it be the least charm of the spectacle that it will enable us to compare this living species with other edentata of South America, such as the Megatherium, now only found in the fossil state, but so admirably restored by Mr. Hawkins for the Crystal Palace. We need not dwell on the admirable adaptation of the ant-eater to its position and to its few and simple wants. To those who have not studied the works of the Lord, it may appear uncouth and unattractive. Compared with a dog, it is stupid, and alongside of a lion, it is slow. It has not the symmetry of the horse, nor the beautiful markings of the zebra and leopard, but its Creator has given it the instincts, the form, the muscular powers, and the colors which best answer its purpose. And no one can say that it is plain and ugly who looks at its legs so prettily variegated with white and black, and its noble black collar. Those of our readers who wish further information will find it in the Literary Gazette for October 8, 1853. In that article it is easy to recognize the Roman hand of the facile princeps among living comparative anatomists. Long may it be before either of our new acquaintances in the garden afford him a subject for dissertation, but when that day arrives, we hope that he will not delay to publish the memoir. A. White, in Excelsior, with additions. End of The Great Anteater. Recording by Rosie.
The Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger by L. Frank Baum, from Little Wizard Stories of Oz. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection No. 8. In the splendid palace of the Emerald City, which is in the centre of the fairyland of Oz, is a great throne room, where Princess Ozma, the ruler, for an hour each day sits in a throne of glistening emeralds, and listens to all the troubles of her people, which they are sure to tell her about. Around Ozma's throne on such occasions are grouped all the important personages of Oz, such as the Scarecrow, Jack Pumpkinhead, Tick-Tock the Clockwork Man, the Tin Woodman, the Wizard of Oz, the Shaggy Man, and other famous fairy people. Little Dorothy usually has a seat at Ozma's feet, and crouched on either side of the throne are two enormous beasts known as the Hungry Tiger and the Cowardly Lion. These two beasts are Ozma's chief guardians, but as everyone loves the beautiful girl princess, there has never been any disturbance in the great throne room, or anything for the guardians to do but look fierce and solemn and keep quiet until the royal audience is over and the people go away to their homes. Of course, no one would dare be naughty while the huge lion and tiger crouched beside the throne, but the fact is, the people of Oz are very seldom naughty, so Ozma's big guards are more ornamental than useful, and no one realizes that better than the beasts themselves. One day, after everyone had left the throne room except the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger, the lion yawned and said to his friend, "Oh, I'm getting tired of this job. No one is afraid of us, and no one pays any attention to us." "That is true," replied the big tiger, purring softly. "We might as well be in the thick jungles where we were born as trying to protect Ozma when she needs no protection." and I'm dreadfully hungry all the time." "You have enough to eat, I'm sure," said the lion, swaying his tail slowly back and forth. "Enough, perhaps, but not the kind of food I long for," answered the tiger. "What I'm hungry for is fat babies. I have a great desire to eat a few fat babies. Then perhaps the people of Oz would fear me, and I'd become more important." "True," agreed the lion. "It would stir up quite a rumpus if you ate but one fat baby. As for myself, my claws are sharp as needles and strong as crowbars, while my teeth are powerful enough to tear a person to pieces in a few seconds. If I should spring upon a man and make chop suey of him, there would be wild excitement in the Emerald City, and people would fall upon their knees and beg me for mercy. That, in my opinion, would render me of considerable importance." "After you had torn the person to pieces, what would you do next?" asked the tiger sleepily. "Then I would roar so loudly that it would shake the earth, and stalk away to the jungle to hide myself before anyone could attack me or kill me for what I had done." "I see," nodded the tiger. "You are really cowardly." "To be sure. That is why I am named the Cowardly Lion. That is why I have always been so tame and peaceable. But I'm awfully tired of being tame," added the lion with a sigh, "and it would be fun to raise a row and show people what a terrible beast I really am." The tiger remained silent for several minutes, thinking deeply as he slowly washed his face with his left paw. Then he said, "I'm getting old, and it would please me to eat at least one fat baby before I die. Suppose we surprise these people of Oz and prove our power. What do you say? We will walk out of here just as usual, and the first baby we meet, I'll eat in a jiffy, and the first man or woman you meet, you will tear to pieces. Then we will both run out of the city gates and gallop across the country and hide in the jungle before anyone can stop us." "All right, I'm game," said the lion, yawning again, so he showed 2 rows of dreadfully sharp teeth. The tiger got up and stretched his great sleek body. "Come on," he said. The lion stood up and proved he was the larger of the 2, for he was almost as big as a small horse. Out of the palace they walked and met no one. They passed through the beautiful grounds, past fountains and beds of lovely flowers, and met no one. Then they unlatched a gate and entered a street of the city, and met no one. "I wonder how a fat baby will taste," remarked the tiger as they stalked majestically along, side by side. "I imagine it will taste like nutmegs," said the lion. "No," said the tiger. "I've an idea it will taste like gumdrops." They turned a corner, but met no one, for the people of the Emerald City were accustomed to take their naps at this hour of the afternoon. "I wonder how many pieces I ought to tear a person into," said the lion in a thoughtful voice. 60 would be about right," suggested the tiger. "Would that hurt any more than to tear one into about a dozen pieces?" inquired the lion with a little shudder. "Who cares whether it hurts or not?" growled the tiger. The lion did not reply. They entered a side street, but met no one. Suddenly they heard a child crying. "Aha!" exclaimed the tiger. "There is my meat." He rushed around a corner, the lion following, and came upon a nice fat baby sitting in the middle of the street and crying as if in great distress. "What's the matter?" asked the tiger, crouching before the baby. I lost my mama," wailed the baby. "Why, you poor little thing," said the great beast, softly stroking the child's head with its paw. "Don't cry, my dear, for Mamma can't be far away, and I'll help you to find her." "Go on," said the lion who stood by. "Go on where?" asked the tiger, looking up. "Go on and eat your fat baby." "Why, you dreadful creature," said the tiger reproachfully. "Would you want me to eat a poor little lost baby that doesn't know where its mother is?" And the beast gathered the little one into its strong, hairy arms and tried to comfort it by rocking it gently back and forth. The lion growled low in his throat and seemed very much disappointed. But at that moment a scream reached their ears, and a woman came bounding out of a house and into the street. Seeing her baby in the embrace of the monster tiger, the woman screamed again and rushed forward to rescue it. But in her haste, she caught her foot in her skirt and tumbled head over heels and heels over head, stopping with such a bump that she saw many stars in the heavens, although it was broad daylight. And there she lay, in a helpless manner, all tangled up and unable to stir. With one bound and a roar like thunder, the huge lion was beside her. With his strong jaws, he grasped her dress and raised her up into an upright position. "Poor thing, are you hurt?" he gently asked. Gasping for breath, the woman struggled to free herself and tried to walk, but she limped badly and tumbled down again. "My baby," she said pleadingly. "The baby is all right. Don't worry," replied the lion. And then he added, "Keep quiet now, and I'll carry you back to your house, and the hungry tiger will carry your baby." The tiger, who had approached the place with the child in his arms, asked in astonishment, "Aren't you going to tear her into 60 pieces?" "No, nor into 6 pieces," answered the lion indignantly. "I'm not such a brute as to destroy a poor woman who has hurt herself trying to save her lost baby. If you are so ferocious and cruel and bloodthirsty, you may leave me and go away, for I do not care to associate with you." "That's all right," answered the tiger. "I'm not cruel, not in the least. I'm only hungry. But I thought you were cruel." "Thank heaven I'm respectable," said the lion with dignity. He then raised the woman, and with much gentleness carried her into her house, where he laid her upon a sofa. The tiger followed with the baby, which he safely deposited beside the mother. The little one liked the hungry tiger, and grasping the enormous beast by both ears, the baby kissed the beast's nose to show he was grateful and happy. "Thank you very much," said the woman. "I've often heard what good beasts you are, in spite of your power to do mischief to mankind. And now I know that the stories are true. I do not think either of you have ever had an evil thought." The hungry tiger and the cowardly lion hung their heads and did not look into each other's eyes, for both were shamed and humbled. They crept away and stalked back through the streets until they again entered the palace grounds, where they retreated to the pretty comfortable rooms they occupied at the back of the palace. There they silently crouched in their usual corners to think about their adventure. After a while the tiger said sleepily, "I don't believe fat babies taste like gumdrops. I'm quite sure they have the flavour of raspberry tarts. My, how hungry I am for fat babies." The lion grunted disdainfully. "You're a humbug," said he. "Am I?" retorted the tiger with a sneer. "Tell me then, into how many pieces do you usually tear your victims, my bold lion?" The lion impatiently thumped the floor with his tail. "To tear anybody into pieces would soil my claws and blunt my teeth," he said. "I'm glad I didn't muss myself up this afternoon by hurting that poor mother." The tiger looked at him steadily, and then yawned a wide, wide yawn. "You're a coward," he remarked. "Well," said the lion, "it's better to be a coward than to do wrong." "To be sure," answered the other, "and that reminds me that I nearly lost my own reputation, for had I eaten that fat baby, I would not now be the hungry tiger. It is better to go hungry, seems to me, than to be cruel to a little child." And then they dropped their heads on their paws and went to sleep. End of The Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger by L. Frank Baum.
Excerpt from Walden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Excerpt from Walden by Henry David Thoreau. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection No. 8. I was witness to events of a less peaceful character. One day when I went out to my wood pile, or rather my pile of stumps, I observed two large ants, the one red, the other much larger, nearly half an inch long, and black, fiercely contending with one another. Having once got hold, they never let go, but struggled and wrestled and rolled on the chips incessantly. Looking farther, I was surprised to find that the chips were covered with such combatants. This was not a duellum, but a bellum, a war between two races of ants, the red always pitted against the black, and frequently two red ones to one black. The legions of these myrmidons covered all the hills and vales in my wood yard, and the ground was already strewn with the dead and dying, both red and black. It was the only battle which I have ever witnessed, the only battlefield I ever trod while the battle was raging. Internecine war, the red republicans on the one hand, the black imperialists on the other. On every side they were engaged in deadly combat, yet without any noise that I could hear, and human soldiers never fought so resolutely. I watched a couple that were fast locked in each other's embraces, in a little sunny valley amid the chips, now at noonday prepared to fight till the sun went down, or life went out. The smaller red champion had fastened himself like a vice to his adversary's front, and through all the tumblings on that field never for an instant ceased to gnaw at one of his feelers near the root, having already caused the other to go by the board; while the stronger black one dashed him from side to side, and, as I saw on looking nearer, had already divested him of several of his members. They fought with more pertinacity than bulldogs. Neither manifested the least disposition to retreat. It was evident that their battle cry was, "Conquer or die." In the meanwhile there came along a single red ant on the hillside of this valley, evidently full of excitement, who either had dispatched his foe, or had not yet taken part in the battle; probably the latter, for he had lost none of his limbs; whose mother had charged him to return with his shield, or upon it. Or perchance he was some Achilles, who had nourished his wrath apart, and had now come to avenge or rescue his Patroclus. He saw this unequal combat from afar, for the blacks were nearly twice the size of the red. He drew near with rapid pace till he stood on his guard within half an inch of the combatants. Then, watching his opportunity, he sprang upon the black warrior, and commenced his operations near the root of his right foreleg, leaving the foe to select among his own members. And so there were three united for life, as if a new kind of attraction had been invented which put all other locks and cements to shame. I should not have wondered by this time to find that they had their respective musical bands stationed on some eminent chip, and, playing their national airs the while, to excite the slow and cheer the dying combatants. I was myself excited somewhat even, as if they had been men. The more you think of it, the less the difference. And certainly there is not the fight recorded in Concord history, at least, if in the history of America, that will bear a moment's comparison with this, whether for the numbers engaged in it, or for the patriotism and heroism displayed. For numbers and for carnage, it was an Austerlitz or Dresden. Concord fight! 2 killed on the patriots' side, and Luther Blanchard wounded. Why, here every ant was a Buttrick. Fire, for God's sake, fire! And thousands shared the fate of Davis and Hosmer. There was not one hireling there. I have no doubt that it was a principle they fought for, as much as our ancestors, and not to avoid a 3-penny tax on their tea. And the results of this battle will be as important and memorable to those whom it concerns as those of the Battle of Bunker Hill at least. I took up the chip on which the three I have particularly described were struggling, carried it into my house, and placed it under a tumbler on my window sill, in order to see the issue. Holding a microscope to the first mentioned red ant, I saw that, though he was assiduously gnawing at the near foreleg of his enemy, having severed his remaining feeler, his own breast was all torn away, exposing what vitals he had there to the jaws of the black warrior, whose breastplate was apparently too thick for him to pierce; and the dark carbuncles of the sufferer's eyes shone with ferocity such as war only could excite. They struggled half an hour longer under the tumbler, and when I looked again, the black soldier had severed the heads of his foes from their bodies, and the still living heads were hanging on either side of him like ghastly trophies at his saddle bow, still apparently as firmly fastened as ever, and he was endeavoring with feeble struggles, being without feelers and with only the remnant of a leg, and I know not how many other wounds, to divest himself of them, which at length, after half an hour more, he accomplished. I raised the glass, and he went off over the window-sill in that crippled state. Whether he finally survived that combat, and spent the remainder of his days in some Hôtel des Invalides, I do not know. But I thought that his industry would not be worth much thereafter. I never learned which party was victorious, nor the cause of the war; but I felt for the rest of that day as if I had had my feelings excited and harrowed by witnessing the struggle, the ferocity and carnage, of a human battle before my door. Kirby and Spence tell us that the battles of ants have long been celebrated, and the date of them recorded, though they say that Huber is the only modern author who appears to have witnessed them. Aeneas Sylvius, they say, after giving a very circumstantial account of one contested with great obstinacy by a great and small species on the trunk of a pear tree, adds that this action was fought in the pontificate of Eugenius IV., in the presence of Nicholas Pistoriensis, an eminent lawyer, who related the whole history of the battle with the greatest fidelity. A similar engagement between great and small ants is recorded by Olaus Magnus, in which the small ones, being victorious, are said to have buried the bodies of their own soldiers, but left those of their giant enemies a prey to the birds. This event happened previous to the expulsion of the tyrant Christiern II from Sweden. The battle which I witnessed took place in the presidency of Polk, 5 years before the passage of Webster's Fugitive Slave Bill. End of Excerpt from Walden, by Henry David Thoreau.
The Hare. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. The Hare by Francis C. Woodworth. From Stories About Animals with Pictures to Match. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Number 8. Probably most of my readers are so well acquainted with natural history that they do not need to be told that the hare and the rabbit are very like, in their appearance as well as in most of their habits. The two animals, however, are sufficiently unlike to be entitled to a separate introduction in our stories. Hares have been known to possess a good deal of cunning, which is a fortunate circumstance for them, as they often need not a little of this trait of character in their numerous persecutions. I have seen, says Dufouillou, a French naturalist, a hare so cunning that as soon as it heard the huntsman's horn it started from its place, and though the distance of a quarter of a league from it, leaped to a pond, and there hid itself among the rushes, thus escaping the pursuit of the dogs. I have seen a hare which, after having run above 2 hours before the dogs, has dislodged another hare, and taken possession of its residence. I have seen them swim over 3 ponds, of which the smallest was not less than 80 paces broad. I have seen others, which, after having been warmly chased for 2 hours, have entered a sheep-cot, through the little opening under the door, and remained among the cattle. Others again, when the dogs have chased them, have joined a flock of sheep in the field, and, in like manner, remained with them. I have seen others, which, when they heard the dogs, have concealed themselves in the earth, or have gone along on one side of a hedge, and returned by the other, so that there was only the thickness of the hedge between the dogs and the hare. I have seen others, which, after they have been chased for half an hour, have mounted an old wall of 6 feet high, and taken refuge in a hole covered with ivy. An English hunter tells a very affecting anecdote about 2 hares which were chased by a pack of dogs. A hare which they had pursued for some time was nearly exhausted. On the way he came across another hare, doubtless a personal friend of his. The latter, after a short conversation with the former, for there was not time for many ceremonies, took the place of the poor weary one, and allowed himself to be chased by the dogs, while the other, who must soon have fallen a victim to the dogs, was left to shift as best he could, and to find a place of shelter. The hares in Liberia exhibit much foresight. In the month of August they cut great quantities of soft, tender grass and other herbs, which they spread out to dry. This hay, early in autumn, they collect into heaps, and place either beneath the overhanging rocks or about the trunks of trees, in conical heaps of various sizes, resembling the stacks in which men sometimes preserve their hay in winter. These stacks which the hares make are much smaller, however, not usually more than 3 feet high. In the winter these stacks are covered with snow, and the animals make a path between them and their holes. They select the best of vegetables for their winter store, and crop them when in the fullest vigour, and these they make into the best and greenest hay. Dr. Towson, while in Gottingen, succeeded in getting a young hare so tame that it would play about his sofa and bed. It would leap upon his knee, pat him with his forefeet, and frequently, while he was reading, it would jump up in his lap and knock the book out of his hand, so as to get a share of his attention. One Sunday evening 5 men were sitting on the bank of the river Mersey in England, singing sacred songs. The field where they were had a forest on one side. As they were singing, a hare came out of this forest and ran toward the place where they were seated. As she came up very near the spot, she suddenly stopped and stood still for a considerable time, appearing to enjoy the sound of the music. She frequently turned her head, as if listening with intense interest. When they stopped singing she turned slowly toward the forest. She had nearly reached the forest when the gentleman commenced singing again. The hare turned around and ran back swiftly, nearly to the spot where she had stood before, and listened with the same apparent pleasure until the music was finished. Then she again retired towards the woods, and soon disappeared. Cooper was a great lover of pets, and I confess that I love him for this trait of his character. He has endeared himself to me, indeed, as much by the kindness he showed to the different animals which he had about him, and which he had taught to love him, as by almost any other act of his. I never think of Cooper without thinking, too, of the interest he took in everything that breathed, and I hardly ever see a pet hare, or rabbit, or squirrel, without thinking of him. If the reader is as much interested in the poet as I am, he will like to see a portrait of him which I introduce in this connection. Many people take great delight in hunting such beautiful and innocent animals as the fawn and the hare, but Cooper was no sportsman. He could not bear to hurt anything that lived. You remember, perhaps, that he says in his task about being kind to animals. Let me see if I can quote it from memory. I guess I can, for I learned it at school when a little boy, and those things are always fixed in the memory more indelibly than those which are learned in maturer years. I think he says, "I would not enter on my list of friends, though graced and polished manners and fine sense, yet wanting sensibility, the man who needlessly sets foot upon a worm. An inadvertent step may crush the snail that crawls at eve along the public path, but he who has humanity forewarned will step aside and let the reptile live." He was right. The kind-hearted poet was right. Well, as I said before, he was not only careful about giving pain to animals, but he was very fond of pets. First and last he had a good many of these pets, but there were none of them that he took so great delight in as his hares. He had 2 of these pretty little creatures, and they seemed to be as fond of him as he was of them. Cooper was subject to fits of great despondency or depression of spirits. With him hypochondria was a sort of chronic disease. He would try to be cheerful. He knew the nature of his melancholy, and often tried to remedy indirectly what could not be reached directly. He resorted to innocent amusements in order to lead the mind away from the contemplation of its own ills, real or imaginary. This was well, it was philosophical, but it did not always succeed. The disease was too deeply seated in his system. The care which he took of his pets was no doubt one of his favourite amusements. These hares, there were 3 of them at first, though one of them did not live long, had each very different characters. The poet described them in detail in one of his letters. Puss was the greatest favourite. He was more tractable, tame, and affectionate than the rest. Once the fellow was very sick, and his master treated him with a great deal of kindness, gave him medicine, and nursed him so well that he recovered. Cooper says that Puss showed his gratitude by licking his hand for a long time, a ceremony he never went through with but once in his life, before or afterward. Bess, who died young, was the funny one. He had a great fund of humour and drollery. Tiny, though very entertaining in his way, seems to have been rather a grave and surly fellow. When he died, and he lived to a good old age, some 9 years, I think, Cooper buried him with honour, and wrote an epitaph for him. I will copy 2 or 3 stanzas from this epitaph to show that Tiny got quite as good a character as he deserved. Epitaph on a Hare. Here lies, whom hound did ne'er pursue, nor swifter greyhound follow, whose feet ne'er tainted morning dew, nor ear heard huntsman's hallo. Old tiniest, surliest of his kind, who nursed with tender care, and to domestic bounds confined, was still a wild jack-hare. Though duly from my hand he took his pittance every night, he did it with a jealous look, and when he could, would bite. I kept him for his humour's sake, for he would oft beguile my heart of thought that made it ache, and force me to a smile. And now beneath this walnut shade he finds his long last home, and waits in snug concealment laid, till gentler puss shall come. He, still more aged, feels the shocks from which no power can save, and partner once of Tiny's box, must soon partake his grave. End of The Hare by Francis C. Woodworth.
A moral. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Mole by Elizabeth Brightwen. From Wild Nature Won by Kindness. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Number 8. A live mole above ground is a somewhat rare sight, for, as a rule, his habits are altogether subterranean. But now and then he may be captured by a sudden grasp as he scrambles along in his odd, unwieldy fashion, and a curious fellow he is in many ways. Strolling quietly along a country lane one summer's evening, I heard a great rustling in a dry ditch. The dead leaves were being scattered right and left, and I stopped to see what could be the cause. In a minute the black velvet coat of a mole appeared, and I at once resolved to endeavour to catch it, though with little hope of success, for the creature is apt to dive into the ground in an instant when alarmed. However, watching my opportunity, I managed to seize and hold him firmly. But I had nothing to put him in, and he struggled furiously to escape. All I could do was to roll him up in one end of my black lace shawl and hurry home with my capture. Alas for the unlucky shawl! The mole soon began rending and tearing it into shreds with his powerful feet and teeth. I was rapidly becoming acquainted with the habits of moles, and in a way that I should not soon forget. Still, that mole must be brought home somehow, and I next transferred him to my dress pocket, which I held fast, whilst he scrambled and pushed his strong little snout in all directions to find some way of escape. He was soon placed in a zinc fern case, with glass sides, supplied with earth to burrow in, and fed with worms. I also gave him a pan of water, as I remembered seeing a plan of a mole's burrow which always includes a place for water. It was a really painful sight to watch the creature feeding. He pounced upon a worm with the fury of a tiger, and holding it in his mouth, tore it to pieces with his sharp claws, and rapidly devoured all the pieces, and snuffing about to make sure he had quite finished it, he then darted off to seek another. The mole has a most voracious appetite, and dies very quickly if unable to obtain food. I was interested to watch the bustling, active life of the little creature. His morning toilet, when the black velvet coat was attended to, carefully brushed and licked by a tiny red tongue, though it never seemed to pick up dirt or defilement in its passage through the earth. And finally, after a few days, I had the pleasure of setting him free, when he dived into the ground out of sight in a moment. Some years later, a live mole was much desired by a young relative who was giving natural history lectures to some school children. It happened that a mole had found its way into the conservatory, and was doing much damage there by making its runs close to the surface and uprooting the plants in its course. The gardener and I resolved to catch it. He was anxious to prevent further mischief to his plants, and I was wishing to help the lecturer by sending a lively specimen to illustrate his subject. The exciting part of the business was the necessity of making the capture before 11 o'clock, when the carrier would pass by, and, taking charge of the animal, would deliver it in time for the lecture next day. We watched for the upheaving of the mole's run, which came at last. The gardener made a quick plunge with his hand into the soft earth, but alas, the mole escaped. He kept quiet for 10 minutes, then another attempt was made, and failed. The carrier's bell sounded and he passed by. I still kept watch, and again saw the earth move. The third time was successful. I had gone to find a tin box, and on my return I was greeted with, "Here's the mole, ma'am." Poor fellow! He was being ignominiously held up by the scruff of his neck, and kicking furiously at the indignity. He was soon packed up in soft grass, with a plentiful supply of worms to feast upon by the way. A special messenger overtook the carrier, and a telegram was sent to announce the dispatch of the precious animal, He first reached a London office, where I fear he tended to hinder business, as it was needful to transfer him to a cage, and no one seemed particularly anxious for the honour of catching him, as his teeth were known to be both sharp and numerous, and his disposition not of the meekest. However, he was placed in his cage, travelled down into Kent, and gave wonderful pleasure when exhibited to the children. One would naturally suppose that in a country village where boys and girls are daily going to and from school, they would all have been familiar with this little creature, but when the question was asked if they had ever seen a dead mole, only 15 children out of 90 had seen one, and only 3 had ever seen a live one. Next day the mole was let loose upon a very hard piece of ground, but even there he very quickly burrowed out of sight. End of A Mole by Elizabeth Brightwen.
The Monkey Tribe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wyatt Oakley. The Monkey Tribe by Francis C. Woodward. From Stories About Animals with Pictures to Match. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 8. Of course, my readers are in some measure familiar with the tricks of this large and notorious family of animals. But one is not easily wearied with their antics. They afford us, the most sober and sedate of us, an immense amount of material for amusement. I confess I have stopped in the street many a time to see a sage monkey go through his grotesque maneuvers, under the direction of a tutor who ground out music from a wheezing hand organ, and had been willing to undergo the penance of hearing the music of the master, for the sake of witnessing the genius of the pupil. I can conceive of nothing more excessively ludicrous than many of these exhibitions. But I must not detain the reader from the stories any longer. A foreign gentleman of distinction, having to attend the court of Louis XVI of France, took with him his favorite monkey. Soon after his arrival, he was invited to attend a great ball at Versailles, and anxious to perform his part with credit in that fashionable country, he engaged one of the first dancing masters in the city to teach him the latest mood. Every day he employed several hours in practicing his lessons with the tutor so as to be au fait, as the French people have it, quite at home in the ballroom. Pug made his observations very attentively, watching all his motions. He also scrutinized the musician very closely, as he was engaged in instructing the gentleman and playing on his violin. At the close of his lesson, the foreigner was in the habit of going to his mirror and of practicing before it, by himself, for a considerable time, till he was in measure satisfied with his performances, and pretty sure, we may suppose, that he would make a fine figure at court when the ball should come off. One day, after the gentleman had been exercising in this manner, and had just left the room, the monkey, who had been looking on with interest as usual, left his post of observation, took up the violin, which had been left there by the musician, and commenced playing and imitating the dancing of his master before the mirror. There is no knowing how much of a dancer he would have become if he had been allowed to practice as much as he desired. As it was, however, his training for the ball was very suddenly terminated by the entrance of a servant into the room, while the student was in the midst of his performances. A monkey tied to a stake was robbed by the crows, in the West Indies, of his food, and he conceived the following plan of punishing the thieves. He feigned death, and lay perfectly motionless on the ground near to his stake. The birds approached by degrees, and got near enough to steal his food, which he allowed them to do. This he repeated several times, till they became so bold as to come within the reach of his claws. He calculated his distance, and laid hold on one of them. Death was not his plan of punishment. He was more refined in his cruelty. He plucked every feather out of the bird, and then let him go and show himself to his companions. He made a man of him according to the ancient definition of a biped without feathers. An organ grinder, with his monkey, being taken before the mayor of New Orleans for exhibiting themselves without a license, the monkey was so polite to the mayor, took off his hat, and made so many bows to his honor that the two were permitted to depart in peace. It is said that no lawyer would have managed the case better than the monkey did. A gentleman living in Bath, England, had a monkey who used to perform a great many very amusing tricks in imitation of his master. The gentleman was a great politician and was in the habit of reading his newspaper very punctually every morning at the breakfast table. One day, business having compelled him to leave the table earlier than usual, Pug was found seated in his chair with his master's spectacles on, and the Courier newspaper upside down, reading as gravely and with as much apparent interest as the politician. Once in a while, he looked off his paper and chattered and made significant gestures, as his master was in the habit of doing when he came across anything very especially interesting. A farmer in the West Indies had planted a field with Indian corn. Numerous monkeys inhabited a forest nearby, who had attentively observed the planting process and the method by which it was cultivated. They seemed to take not a little interest in the whole matter. The farmer had the pleasure of seeing his crop of corn nearly ready for harvesting, but the monkeys took care that he should not have the trouble of harvesting it. One night, they issued from the forest in vast numbers, forming themselves into long lines between it and the cornfield. All was conducted in silence. Each was intent on the business in hand. Those in front of the lines plucked off the ears of corn with great dexterity, and passed them to his nearest companion, who handed them forward from one to another till they reached the woods. In this manner the work proceeded till daylight, when the slaves found the thieves finishing the operation. It had been a very profitable night's labor for the mischievous fellows. The corn was pretty nearly all disposed of. Before the owner of it could get his workmen together with suitable weapons of defense, the whole troop had disappeared in the forest. What a chattering there must have been among them when they all met at their rendezvous. How knowing they must have looked as they said one to another, "Wasn't that thing managed pretty nicely?" In Sierra Leone is a species of orangutan so strong and so industrious that when properly trained and fed, they work like servants. They generally walk upright on their two hind feet. Sometimes they are employed to pound substances in a mortar, and they are frequently taught to go to rivers and to bring water in small pitchers. They usually carry the water on their heads. When they come to the door of the house, if the pitchers are not soon taken off, they let them fall, and when they perceive that they are broken, the poor fellows sometimes weep like a child in anticipation of the flogging they are to receive. Buffon saw an orangutan that performed a multitude of funny tricks. He would present his hand to lead his visitors about the room, and promenade as gravely as if he was one of the most important personages in the company. He would even sit down at table, unfold his napkin, wipe his lips like any other gentleman, use a spoon or fork in carrying food to his mouth, pour his liquor into a glass, for it seems he had not become a convert to the principles of total abstinence, and touch his glass to that of the person who drank with him. When invited to take tea, he brought a cup and saucer, placed them on the table, put in sugar, poured out the tea, and after allowing it to cool, drank it with the utmost propriety. End of The Monkey Tribe by Francis C. Woodward. Recording by Wyatt Oakley from Wyatt Oakley Voiceovers. Please visit www.wyattoakley.com.
My Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Loveday. My Horses by Théophile Gaultier, translated by Professor F.C. de Sumicrast, from My Private Menagerie, from The Works of Théophile Gaultier, Volume 19. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Number 8. Now let not the reader, on seeing this title, hastily accuse me of being a swell. Horses! That is a pretentious word to be written down by a man of letters. Musa pedestris, says Horace, that is, the muse goes on foot, and Parnassus itself has but one horse in its stable, Pegasus. Besides, he is a winged steed, and by no means quiet in harness, if we may credit what Schiller tells us in his ballad. I am not a sportsman, alas, and deeply do I regret it, for I am as fond of horses as if I had 500,000 a year, and I am entirely of the opinion of the Arabs concerning pedestrians. The horse is man's natural pedestal, and the one complete being is the centaur, whom mythology so ingeniously invented. Nevertheless, although I am merely a man of letters, I have owned horses. In the year 1843 or 1844, I found in the pay dirt of journalism, washed out in the wooden pan of the phaeton, a sufficient quantity of gold dust to justify the hope that I might feed, besides my cats, dogs, and magpies, a couple of animals of larger size. I first had a couple of Shetland ponies, the size of big dogs, hairy as bears, all mane and tail, and who looked at me in such friendly fashion through their long black hair that I felt more like showing them into the drawing-room than sending them to the stable. They would take sugar out of my pockets like trained horses. But they proved to be decidedly too small. They would have answered as saddle horses for English children 8 years of age, or as coach horses for Tom Thumb, but I was already in the enjoyment of that athletic and portly frame for which I am famed, and which has enabled me to bear up, without bending too much under the burden, under 40 consecutive years of supplying of copy. The difference between the owner and the animals was unquestionably too striking, even though the little black ponies drew at a very lively gait the light phaeton to which they were harnessed with the daintiest tan harness, that looked as if it had been bought in a toy shop. Comic illustrated papers were not as numerous then as now, but there were quite enough of them to publish caricatures of me and of my horses. It goes without saying that, profiting by the latitude allowed to caricature, I was represented as of elephantine bulk and appearance, like the god Ganesa, the Hindu god of wisdom, and that my ponies were shown as no larger than poodles, rats, or mice. It is also true that I could readily enough have carried my pair one under each arm, and taken the carriage on my back. I did for a moment think of having a pony 4 in hand, but such a Lilliputian equipage would have merely attracted greater attention. So to my great regret, for I had already become fond of them, I replaced my Shetlands with 2 dapple-grey cobs of larger size, with powerful necks, broad chests, stout and well set up, which were not Mecklenburgers, no doubt, but plainly more capable of dragging me along. They were both mares, the one called Jane, the other Betsy. So far as outward looks went, they were as alike as 2 peas, and never was there a better matched pair, apparently. But Betsy was as lazy as Jane was willing. While the one drew steadily, the other was satisfied with trotting along, saving herself, and taking good care to do nothing. These 2 animals, of the same breed, of the same age, and destined to live in the same stable, had the liveliest antipathy for each other. They could not bear one another, fought in the stable, and bit each other as they reared in harness. It was impossible to reconcile them, which was a pity, for with their hog manes, like those of the horses on the Parthenon frieze, their quivering nostrils, and their eyes dilated with anger, they looked uncommonly handsome as they were driven up or down the Avenue de Champs-Élysées. A substitute had to be found for Betsy, and a small mare, somewhat lighter coloured, for it had been impossible to match her exactly, was brought round. Jane immediately welcomed the newcomer, and did the honours of the stable to her most graciously, and ere long they became fast friends. Jane would rest her head on Blanche's neck. She had been so called because her grey coat was rather whitish, and when they were let loose in the yard after being rubbed down, they would play together like a pair of dogs or children. If one was taken out driving, the one left in the stable was plainly wearying for her, and as soon as she heard in the distance the ring of her companion's hoofs on the paving stones, she set up a joyous neigh, like a trumpet blast, to which the other did not fail to reply as she approached. They would come up to be harnessed with astonishing docility, and took of themselves their proper place by the pole. Like all animals that are loved and well treated, Jane and Blanche soon became most familiar and trusting. They would follow me without bridle or halter like the best trained dog, and when I stopped they would stick their noses on my shoulder in order to be caressed. Jane was fond of bread, and Blanche of sugar, and both were crazy about melon skin. I could make them do anything in return for these dainties. If man were not odiously brutal and ferocious, as he too frequently shows himself towards animals, they would cling to him most gladly. Their dim brain is filled with the thought of that being who thinks, speaks, and does things the meaning of which escapes them. He is a mystery and a wonder to them. They will often look at you with eyes full of questions you cannot answer, for the key to their speech has not yet been found. Yet they have a speech which enables them to exchange, by means of intonations not yet noted by man, ideas that are rudimentary, no doubt, but which are such as may be conceived by creatures within their sphere of action and feeling. Less stupid than we are, animals succeed in understanding a few words of our idiom, but not enough to enable them to converse with us. Besides, as the words they do learn refer solely to what we exact of them, the conversation would be brief. But that animals speak cannot be doubted by anyone who has lived in any degree of intimacy with dogs, cats, horses, or other creatures of that sort. For instance, Jane was naturally intrepid. She never refused, and nothing frightened her. But after a few months of cohabitation with Blanche, her character changed, and she manifested at times sudden and inexplicable fear. Her companion, much less brave, must have told her ghost stories at night. Often, when going through the Bois de Boulogne at dusk or after dark, Blanche would stop short or shy, as if a phantom, invisible to me, had risen up before her. She trembled in every limb, breathed hard, and broke out into sweat. If I attempted to urge her ahead with the whip, she backed, and all Jane could do, strong as she was insufficient to induce her to go on. One of us would have to get down, cover her eyes with the hand, and lead her until the vision had vanished. Little by little, Jane became subject to the same terror, the reason of which, no doubt, Blanche told her once they were back in their stable. I may as well confess that, for my part, when I would be driving down a dark road on which the moonlight produced alternations of light and shadow, and Blanche suddenly became rooted to the spot as though a spectre had sprung at her head, and refused to move, she who was usually so docile that Queen Mab's whip, made of a cricket's bone with a spider's thread for a thong, was enough to start her into a gallop, I could not repress a slight shudder, or refrain from peering into the darkness rather anxiously, while at times the harmless trunks of ash or birch trees would appear to me as spectral-looking as one of Goya's caprices. I took great delight in driving these dear animals myself, and we soon became very intimate. It was merely as a matter of form that I held the reins, for the least click of the tongue was enough to direct them, to turn them to the right or the left, to make them go faster, or to stop them. They quickly learned all my habits, and started of themselves for the office, the printers, the publishers, the Bois de Boulogne, and the houses where I went to dinner on certain days of the week, and this so accurately that they would have ended by compromising me, for they would have revealed the places to which I paid the most mysterious visits. If I happened to forget the time in the course of an interesting or tender conversation, they would remind me it was getting late by neighing or pawing in front of the balcony. Although I greatly enjoyed traversing the city in the phaeton drawn by my two friends, I could not help at times thinking the north wind sharp and the rain cold, when the months came along which the Republican calendar named so appropriately the months of mist, of frost, of rain, of wind, of snow, brumaire, frimaire, pluvios, ventos, nivus. So I purchased a small blue coupe, lined with white reps, which was likened to the equipage of the famous dwarf of the day, a piece of impertinence I did not mind. A brown coupe, lined with garnet, followed the blue one, and was itself replaced by a dark green coupe lined with dark blue, for I actually did sport a coach, I, poor newspaper writer holding no government stock, for 5 or 6 years. And my ponies were none the less fat and in good condition, though they were fed on literature, had substantives for oats, adjectives for hay, and adverbs for straw. But alas, there came, no one knows very well why, the revolution in February. A great many paving stones were picked up for patriotic purposes, and Paris became rather unfit for carriage travel. I could, of course, have escaladed the barricades with my agile steeds and my light equipage, but it was only at the cook shop that I could get credit, and I could not possibly feed my horses on roast chicken. The horizon was dark with heavy clouds, through which flashed red gleams. Money had taken fright and gone into hiding. The press, on the staff of which I was, had suspended publication, and I was glad enough to find a person willing to buy my horses, harness, and carriages for 1/4 of their value. It was a bitter grief to me, and I would not venture to say that no tears ran down my cheeks onto the manes of Jane and Blanche when they were led away. Sometimes their new owner would drive past the house. I always knew their quick, sharp trot at a distance, and always the sudden way they would stop under my windows proved that they had not forgotten the place where they had been so tenderly loved and so well cared for, and a sigh would break responsive for me as I said to myself, "Poor Jane, poor Blanche, I wonder if they are happy." And the loss of them is the one and only thing I felt sore over when I lost my slender fortune. End of My Horses by Théophile Gaultier. Translated by Professor F.C. de Subicrast. Recording by Loveday.
The Owl-Critic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Owl-Critic by James Thomas Fields. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection No. 8. Who stuffed that white owl? No one spoke in the shop. The barber was busy and he couldn't stop. The customers, waiting their turns, were all reading the Daily, the Herald, the Post, little heeding the young man who blurted out such a blunt question. Not one raised a head or even made a suggestion. And the barber kept on shaving. "Don't you see, Mr. Brown," cried the youth with a frown, "how wrong the whole thing is, how preposterous each wing is, how flattened the head is, how jammed down the neck is? In short, the whole owl, what an ignorant wreck 'tis. I make no apology, I've learned owliology. I've passed days and nights in 100 collections, and cannot be blinded to any deflections arising from unskilful fingers that fail to stuff a bird right from his beak to his tail. Mr. Brown, do take that bird down, or you'll soon be the laughing-stock all over town." And the barber kept on shaving. "I've studied owls and other night fowls, and I tell you what I know to be true. An owl cannot roost with his limbs so unloosed. No owl in this world ever had his claws curled, ever had his legs slanted, ever had his bill canted, ever had his neck screwed into that attitude. He can't do it, because 'tis against all bird laws. Anatomy teaches, ornithology preaches, an owl has a toe that can't turn out so. I've made the white owl my study for years, and to see such a job almost moves me to tears. Mr. Brown, I'm amazed you should be so gone crazed as to put up a bird in that posture absurd. To look at that owl really brings on a dizziness. The man who stuffed him don't know half his business." And the barber kept on shaving. "Examine those eyes. I'm filled with surprise. Taxidermists should pass off on you such poor glass. So unnatural they seem, they'd make Audubon scream, and John Burroughs laugh to encounter such chaff. Do take that bird down, have him stuffed again, Brown." And the barber kept on shaving. "With some sawdust and bark I could stuff in the dark an owl better than that. I could make an old hat look more like an owl than that horrid fowl, stuck up there so stiff like a side of coarse leather. In fact, about him there's not one natural feather." Just then, with a wink and a sly normal lurch, the owl very gravely got down from his perch, walked around and regarded his fault-finding critic, who thought he was stuffed, with a glance analytic, and then fairly hooted as if he should say, "Your learning's at fault this time anyway. Don't waste it again on a live bird, I pray. I'm an owl, you're another. Sir Critic, good day." And the barber kept on shaving. End of The Owl-Critic by James Thomas Fields.
The Ox and Cow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Ox and Cow, from Stories About Animals with Pictures to Match, by Frances C. Woodworth. Can anybody imagine a more perfect picture of quiet contentment than a company of cows that have finished their toils for the day and have come at early evening to chew their cud and to reward their patrons for the supply of green grass that has been afforded them? There are two such amiable cows represented in the engraving on the opposite page. The artist has portrayed them standing before a huge pottery where they seem to be very much at home and at peace with all the world. Their thoughts, if they have any, and doubtless they have, a good many of them, are those of the most tranquil and placid nature. Perhaps they are edifying each other with reflections on the great advantages of the mechanic arts and the art of making earthenware in particular. The old cow is a genuine philosopher. She makes the best of everything. Seldom, very seldom, does she allow herself to get excited. As for being angry, she makes such a bungling piece of work of it whenever she does indulge in a little peevishness, that she seems to cool off at once from the very idea of the ludicrous figure she makes. Generally, she takes the world easy. Her troubles are few. If the flies bite her, and they take that liberty sometimes, she leisurely employs a wand she has at command and brushes them off. Nervous and excitable men might undoubtedly learn a lesson from the philosophical old cow if they would go to school to her. They might learn that the true way to go through the world is to keep tolerably cool, and not to be breaking their heads against every stone wall that happens to lie between them and the object of their desire. There are many anecdotes which prove that the ox and cow have a musical ear, as the phrase is. Professor Bell says that he has often, when a boy, tried the effect of the music of the flute on cows, and always observed that it produced great apparent enjoyment. Instances have been known of the fiercest bulls having been subdued and calmed into gentleness by music of a plaintive kind. There is a laughable story told of the effect of music on a bull. A fiddler, residing in the country, not far from Liverpool, was returning, at 3 o'clock in the morning, with his instrument from a place where he had been engaged in his accustomed vocation. He had occasion to cross a field where there were some cows and a rather saucy bull. The latter took it into his head to assault the fiddler, who tried to escape. He did not succeed, however. The bull was wide awake, and could not let the gentleman off so cheap. The poor fellow then attempted to climb a tree, but the enraged animal would not permit him to do that. The fiddler, who had heard something about the wonderful power of music in subduing the rage of some of the lower animals, thinking of nothing else that he could do for his protection, got behind the tree, and commenced playing, literally for his life. Strange as it may appear, the animal was calmed at once, and appeared to be delighted with the music. By and by, the fiddler, finding that his enemy was entirely pacified, stopped playing, and started homeward as fast as his legs would carry him. But the bull would not allow him to escape, and made after him. The poor fellow, fearing he should be killed, stopped and went to fiddling again. The animal was pacified as before. Our hero then plied the bow until his arm ached, and seizing, as he supposed, a favourable opportunity, he made another effort to run away. He was probably not accustomed to fiddle without pay, and he was pretty sure the customer he was now playing for intended to get his music for nothing. Well, the fiddler was no more successful this time than he was before. The fury of the bull returned as soon as the strains ceased, and at last the poor man surrendered himself to his fate, and actually played for the bull until 6 o'clock, about 3 hours in all, when some people came to his rescue. He must have been pretty well convinced, I think, while he was entertaining the bull in that manner, that music hath charms to soothe the savage breast. End of The Ox and Cow, recording by Rosie.
How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniel Sanchez. How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin by Rudyard Kipling. From Just So Stories. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, number 8. Once upon a time, on an uninhabited island on the shores of the Red Sea, there lived a Parsee, from whose hat the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the Parsee lived by the Red Sea with nothing but his hat and his knife and a cooking stove of the kind that you must particularly never touch. And one day he took flour and water and currants and plums and sugar and things and made himself one cake, which was 2 feet across and 3 feet thick. It was indeed a superior comestible. That's magic. And he put it on stove because he was allowed to cook on the stove, and he baked it till it was all done brown and smelt most sentimental. But just as he was going to eat it, there came down from the beach from the altogether uninhabited interior one rhinoceros with a horn on his nose, 2 piggy eyes, and few manners. In those days the rhinoceros's skin fitted him quite tight. There were no wrinkles in it anywhere. He looked exactly like a Noah's Ark rhinoceros, but of course much bigger. All the same, he had no manners then, and he has no manners now, and he never will have any manners. He said, "How?" and the Parsee left that cake and climbed to the top of a palm tree with nothing on but his hat, from which the rays of the sun were always reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the rhinoceros upset the oil stove with his nose, and the cake rolled on the sand, and he spiked that cake on the horn of his nose, and he ate it, and he went away, waving his tail, to the desolate and exclusively uninhabited interior, which abuts on the islands of Mazumdar, Socotra, and promontories of the larger equinox. Then the Parsee came down from his palm tree, and put the stove on its legs, and recited the following sloka, which, as you have not heard, I will now proceed to relate. Them that takes cakes which the Parsee man bakes makes dreadful mistakes. And there was a great deal more in that than you would think. Because 5 weeks later there was a heat wave in the Red Sea, and everybody took off all the clothes they had. The Parsee took off his hat, but the rhinoceros took off his skin and carried it over his shoulder as he came down to the beach to bathe. In those days it buttoned underneath with 3 buttons and looked like a waterproof. He said nothing whatever about the Parsee's cake, because he had eaten it all, and he never had any manners then, since, or henceforward. He waddled right into the water and blew bubbles through his nose, leaving his skin on the beach. Presently the Parsee came by and found the skin, and he smiled one smile that ran all round his face 2 times. Then he danced 3 times round the skin and rubbed his hands. Then he went to his camp and filled his hat with cake crumbs, for the Parsee never ate anything but cake, and never swept out his camp. He took that skin, and he shook that skin, and he scrubbed that skin, and he rubbed that skin just as full of old, dry, stale, tickly cake crumbs and some burned currants as ever it could possibly hold. Then he climbed to the top of his palm tree and waited for the rhinoceros to come out of the water and put it on. And the rhinoceros did. He buttoned it up with the 3 buttons, and it tickled like cake crumbs in bed. Then he wanted to scratch, but that made it worse, and then he lay down on the sands and rolled and rolled and rolled, and every time he rolled, the cake crumbs tickled him worse and worse and worse. Then he ran to the palm tree and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed himself against it. He rubbed so much and so hard that he rubbed his skin into a great fold over his shoulders, and another fold underneath where the buttons used to be, but he rubbed the buttons off. And he rubbed some more folds over his legs, and it spoiled his temper, but it didn't make the least difference to the cake crumbs. They were inside his skin, and they tickled. So he went home, very angry and indeed horribly scratchy. And from that day to this, every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all on account of the cake crumbs inside. But the Parsee came down from his palm tree wearing his hat, from which the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor, packed up his cooking stove, and went away in the direction of Orotavo, Amygdala, the upland meadows of Anantarivo, and the marshes of Sonaput. This uninhabited island is off Cape Gardafui, by the beaches of Socotra and the pink Arabian Sea, but it's too hot from Suez for the likes of you and me ever to go in a P&O and call on the cake Parsee. End of How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin by Rudyard Kipling. Read by Daniel Sanchez.
Roman Snails. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marian Cervassi. Roman Snails by Elizabeth Brightwin. From Wild Nature Won by Kindness. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, number 8. How can you take an interest in snails and slugs, horrid slimy crawling things? More than once have I heard this kind of remark from youthful lips when I produced my grand old Roman snails and gave them a pleasant time for exercise upon the dewy lawn. Now, in my secret mind, I think a snail is a wonderfully curious creature, neither ugly nor horrid. It is slimy, but about that I shall have something to say later on. When staying at Box Hill, near Dorking, I often saw the great apple snail, Helix palmatia, which is only found on chalk soils, and is supposed to have been introduced by the Romans, from the quantities of their empty shells found with Roman remains in all parts of England. They were kept and fattened in places called cochlearia, and made into various dainty dishes, which the Romans thought quite fit to set before their kings. It is certain that they are very nutritious creatures, and that in times of famine people have supported life and kept themselves mysteriously fat and well-liking by resorting to snails and slugs as articles of diet. Indeed, I have heard more than once that the famous pâté de guimauve owes its healing, nutritive character to this despised univalve, which is said to enter largely into its composition. I brought several apple snails home with me from Box Hill and kept them for many years, until I really believe the creatures, in a dim sort of way, recognized me as their friend, or at any rate their feeder. I cannot boast, as I believe an American lady is said to have done, that her tame oysters followed her up and down stairs, but certainly my snails would, when placed upon the lawn, very frequently crawl towards me, and would do so again and again when removed to a distance. As the weather became cold, they always hibernated, closing the mouth of the shell with a thin, firm covering, or operculum, of chalk which, mixed with their slime, made a substance like plaster of Paris. Thus enclosed, they would lie as if dead until the warmth of the following spring made them push the door open and come out, with excellent appetites, ready to eat voraciously to make up for their long fast. These Roman snails were quite 5 inches long when fully extended, and therefore were much larger than our English species. The body was cream color, and the shell a pale tint of buff, varying somewhat in different specimens. These creatures were kept in a fern case with glass top and sides, and it was singular to observe the way in which they could suspend themselves, as shown in the drawing, from the top of the box. The substance which exists in the caterpillar of the silkworm moth, and which can be drawn out into fine shreds of silk, is very similar to the slime of the snail, only in the latter it is not filiform, but exudes as a liquid, and then hardens into a thin layer of silk, which is strong enough to support the weight of 2 of these snails, for, seeing them one day thus suspended, I put them in the scales and ascertained that the weight of the 2 amounted to 2½ ounces. This mucus forms the glistening shiny track which the snail leaves behind it, enabling it to glide easily and painlessly over rough substances which would otherwise lacerate its soft body. One hardly expected to find social feeling and affection in animals so low down in the scale of nature, but I do not know what else could have led my Romans to caress each other with their long horns by the hour together, and always keep close to one another, twisting and curling their yielding bodies round each other in the most odd contortions. Our English snails hibernate in whole colonies for the winter, which also points to their affectionate and gregarious habits. In lifting up some moss, I once came upon some yellow, half-transparent eggs, about as large as pearl barley, and wishing to know what they would prove to be, I kept them in a damp moss under a tumbler for about a fortnight, when, to my dismay, I found a grand colony of yellow slugs, and not a little was I teased about these interesting young people. I am afraid I must own they were given as a bonne bouche to my Virginian nightingale, who seemed highly to approve of this addition to his daily fare. Snails' eggs are nearly white and semi-transparent. The empty shells of young snails are very lovely when placed in a good microscope, the polariscope bringing out their exquisite prismatic tints. The gardener one day brought in a testacella, or shelled slug. It fed upon earthworms, and was quite unlike the ordinary black or grey slug, of which we have, alas, countless thousands preying upon all the green things of the earth. This shelled slug was yellow, and seemed able to elongate its body very differently to any other species. The shell was quite small, a simple dome-shaped plate upon the anterior part of the body. I kept it for some weeks on damp moss under a tumbler, but it was often able to escape by flattening itself to a mere thread and then crawling under the rim of the tumbler, and at last I gave it liberty as a reward for its persevering efforts to obtain its freedom. End of Roman Snails by Elizabeth Brightwin. Read by Marian Cervassi.
The Sparrows in Madison Square by O. Henry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Mosley. The Sparrows in Madison Square, from Waifs and Strays by O. Henry. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Number 8. The young man in straitened circumstances who comes to New York City to enter literature has but one thing to do, provided he has studied carefully his field in advance. He must go straight to Madison Square, write an article about the sparrows there, and sell it to the Sun for $15. I cannot recall either a novel or a story dealing with the popular theme of the young writer from the provinces who comes to the metropolis to win fame and fortune with his pen, in which the hero does not get his start that way. It does seem strange that some author, in casting about for startlingly original plots, has not hit upon the idea of having his hero write about the bluebirds in Union Square and sell it to the Herald. But a search through the files of metropolitan fiction counts up overwhelmingly for the sparrows and the old garden square, and the Sun always writes the check. Of course, it is easy to understand why this first city venture of the budding author is always successful. He is primed by necessity to a superlative effort. Mid the iron and stone and marble of the roaring city, he has found this spot of singing birds and green grass and trees. Every tender sentiment in his nature is baffling with the sweet pain of homesickness. His genius is aroused as it never may be again. The birds chirp, the tree branches sway, the noise of wheels is forgotten. He writes with his soul in his pen, and he sells it to the Sun for $15. I had read of this custom during many years before I came to New York. When my friends were using their strongest arguments to dissuade me from coming, I only smiled serenely. They did not know of that sparrow graft I had up my sleeve. When I arrived in New York and the car took me straight from the ferry up 23rd Street to Madison Square, I could hear that $15 check rustling in my inside pocket. I obtained lodging at an unhyphenated hostelry, and the next morning I was on a bench in Madison Square almost by the time the sparrows were awake. Their melodious chirping, the benignant spring foliage of the noble trees, and the clean, fragrant grass reminded me so potently of the old farm I had left that tears almost came into my eyes. Then, on a moment, I felt my inspiration. The brave, piercing notes of those cheerful small birds formed a keynote to a wonderful, light, fanciful song of hope and joy and altruism. Like myself, they were creatures with hearts pitched to the tune of woods and fields. As I was, so were they, captives by circumstance in the discordant, dull city. Yet with how much grace and glee they bore the restraint. And then the early morning people began to pass through the square to their work. Sullen people, with sidelong glances and glum faces, hurrying, hurrying, hurrying. They got my theme cut out clear from the bird notes, and wrought it into a lesson, and a poem, and a carnival dance, and a lullaby, and then translated it all into prose, and began to write. For 2 hours my pencil traveled over my pad with scarcely a rest. Then I went to the little room I had rented for 2 days, and there I cut it to half, and then mailed it white hot to the Sun. The next morning I was up by daylight and spent 2 cents of my capital for a paper. If the word sparrow was in it, I was unable to find it. I took it up to my room and spread it out on the bed and went over it column by column. Something was wrong. 3 hours afterward the postman brought me a large envelope containing my manuscript, and a piece of inexpensive paper about 3 inches by 4. I suppose some of you have seen them, upon which was written in violet ink, "With the Sun's thanks." I went over to the square and sat upon a bench. No, I did not think it necessary to eat any breakfast that morning. The confounded pests of sparrows were making the square hideous with their idiotic cheep, cheep. I never saw a bird so persistently noisy, impudent, and disagreeable in all my life. By this time, according to all traditions, I should have been standing in the office of the editor of the Sun. That personage, a tall, grave, white-haired man, would strike a silver bell as he grasped my hand and wiped a suspicious moisture from his glasses. "Mr. McChesney," he would be saying when a subordinate appeared, "this is Mr. Henry, the young man who sent in that exquisite gem about the sparrows in Madison Square. You may give him a desk at once. Your salary, sir, will be $80 a week, to begin with." This was what I had been led to expect by all writers who have evolved romances of literary New York. Something was decidedly wrong with tradition. I could not assume the blame, so I fixed it upon the sparrows. I began to hate them with intensity and heat. At that moment an individual, wearing an excess of whiskers, 2 hats, and a pestilential air, slid into the seat beside me. "Say, Willie," he muttered cajolingly, "could you cough up a dime out of your coffers for a cup of coffee this morning?" "I'm lung-weary, my friend," I said. "The best I can do is 3 cents." "And you look like a gentleman, too," said he. "What brung you down? Boozer?" "Birds," I said fiercely. "The brown-throated songsters, caroling songs of hope and cheer to weary men toiling amid the city's dust and din. The little feathered couriers from the meadows and woods chirping sweetly to us of blue skies and flowering fields. The confounded little squint-eyed nuisances yawping like a flock of steam pianos, and stuffing themselves like aldermen with grass seeds and bugs, while a man sits on a bench and goes without his breakfast. Yes, sir, birds! Look at them!" As I spoke, I picked up a dead tree branch that lay by the bench, and I hurled it with all my force into a close congregation of the sparrows on the grass. The flock flew to the trees with a babel of shrill cries, but 2 of them remained prostrate upon the turf. In a moment my unsavory friend had leaped over the row of benches and secured the fluttering victims, which he thrust hurriedly into his pockets. Then he beckoned me with a dirty forefinger. "Come on, Cully," he said hoarsely. "You're in on the feed." "Thank you very much." Weakly I followed my dingy acquaintance. He led me away from the park down a side street and through a crack in a fence into a vacant lot where some excavating had been going on. Behind a pile of old stones and lumber he paused and took out his birds. "I got matches," said he. "You got any paper to start a fire with?" I drew forth my manuscript story of the sparrows and offered it for burnt sacrifice. There were old planks, splinters, and chips for our fire. My frowsy friend produced, from some interior of his frayed clothing, half a loaf of bread, pepper, and salt. In 10 minutes each of us was holding a sparrow spitted on a stick over the leaping flames. "Say," said my fellow bivouacker, "this ain't so bad when a fellow's hungry. It reminds me of when I struck New York first, about 15 years ago. I come in from the West to see if I could get a job on a newspaper. I hit the Madison Square Park the first morning after, and was sitting around on the benches. I noticed the sparrows chirping, and the grass and trees so nice and green that I thought I was back in the country again. Then I got some papers out of my pocket, and—" "I know," I interrupted. "You sent it to the Sun and got $15. "Say," said my friend suspiciously, "you seem to know a good deal. Where was you? I went to sleep on the bench there in the sun, and somebody touched me for every cent I had. $15. End of The Sparrows in Madison Square by O. Henry. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA.
The Tale of Timmy Tiptoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. The Tale of Tommy Tiptoes by Beatrix Potter. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, number 8. Once upon a time there was a little fat, comfortable gray squirrel called Timmy Tiptoes. He had a nest thatched with leaves in the top of a tall tree, and he had a little squirrel wife called Goody. Timmy Tiptoes sat out enjoying the breeze. He whisked his tail and chuckled. "Little wife Goody, the nuts are ripe. We must lay up a store for winter and spring." Goody Tiptoes was busy pushing moss under the thatch. "The nest is so snug we shall be sound asleep all winter." "Then we shall wake up all the thinner when there is nothing to eat in springtime," replied prudent Timothy. When Timmy and Goody Tiptoes came to the nut thicket, they found other squirrels were there already. Timmy took off his jacket and hung it on a twig. They worked away quietly by themselves. Every day they made several journeys and picked quantities of nuts. They carried them away in bags and stored them in several hollow stumps near the tree where they had built their nest. When these stumps were full they began to empty the bags into a hole high up a tree that had belonged to a woodpecker. The nuts rattled down, down, down inside. "How shall you ever get them out again? It is like a money box," said Goody. "I shall be much thinner before springtime, my love," said Timmy Tiptoes, peeping into the hole. They did collect quantities because they did not lose them. Squirrels who bury their nuts in the ground lose more than half, because they cannot remember the place. The most forgetful squirrel in the wood was called Silvertail. He began to dig, and he could not remember. And then he dug again and found some nuts that did not belong to him, and there was a fight, and other squirrels began to dig. The whole wood was in commotion. Unfortunately, just at this time a flock of little birds flew by, from bush to bush, searching for green caterpillars and spiders. There were several sorts of little birds, twittering different songs. The first one sang, "Who's been digging up my nuts? Who's been digging up my nuts?" And another sang, "Little bit of bread and no cheese, little bit of bread and no cheese." The squirrels followed and listened. The first little bird flew into the bush where Timmy and Goody Tiptoes were quietly tying up their bags, and it sang, "Who's been digging up my nuts? Who's been digging up my nuts?" Timmy Tiptoes went on with his work without replying. Indeed, the little bird did not expect an answer. It was only singing its natural song, and it meant nothing at all. And when the other squirrels heard that song, they rushed upon Timmy Tiptoes and cuffed and scratched him, and upset his bag of nuts. The innocent little bird which had caused all the mischief flew away in a fright. Timmy rolled over and over, and then turned tail and fled towards his nest, followed by a crowd of squirrels shouting, "Who's been digging up my nuts?" They caught him and dragged him up the very same tree, where there was a little round hole, and they pushed him in. The hole was much too small for Timmy Tiptoes' figure. They squeezed him dreadfully. It was a wonder they did not break his ribs. "We will leave him here till he confesses," said Silvertail Squirrel, and he shouted into the hole, "Who's been digging up my nuts?" Timmy Tiptoes made no reply. He had tumbled down inside the tree upon half a peck of nuts belonging to himself. He lay quite stunned and still. Goody Tiptoes picked up the nut bags and went home. She made a cup of tea for Timmy, but he didn't come, and didn't come. Goody Tiptoes passed a lonely and unhappy night. Next morning she ventured back to the nut bushes to look for him, but the other unkind squirrels drove her away. She wandered all over the wood, calling, "Timmy Tiptoes! Timmy Tiptoes! Oh, where is Timmy Tiptoes?" In the meantime Timmy Tiptoes came to his senses. He found himself tucked up in a little moss bed, very much in the dark, feeling sore. It seemed to be underground. Timmy coughed and groaned because his ribs hurt him. There was a chirpy noise, and a small striped chipmunk appeared with a night light, and hoped he felt better. It was most kind to Timmy Tiptoes. It lent him its nightcap, and the house was full of provisions. The chipmunk explained that it had rained nuts through the top of the tree. "Besides, I found a few buried." It laughed and chuckled when it heard Timmy's story. When Timmy was confined to bed, it 'ticed him to eat quantities. "But how shall I ever get out through that hole unless I thin myself? My wife will be anxious." "Just another nut, or 2 nuts. Let me crack them for you," said the chipmunk. Timmy Tiptoes grew fatter and fatter. Now Goody Tiptoes had set to work again by herself. She did not put any more nuts into the woodpecker's hole, because she had always doubted how they could be got out again. She hid them under a tree root. They rattled down, down, down. Once when Goody emptied an extra big bagful, there was a decided squeak, and next time Goody brought another bagful, a little striped chipmunk scrambled out in a hurry. "It's getting perfectly full up downstairs. The sitting room is full, and they are rolling along the passage, and my husband, Chippy Hackee, has run away and left me. What is the explanation of these shower of nuts?" "I'm sure I beg your pardon. I did not know that anybody lived here," said Mrs. Goody Tiptoes. "But where is Chippy Hackee? My husband, Timmy Tiptoes, has run away too." "I know where Chippy is. A little bird told me," said Mrs. Chippy Hackee. She led the way to the woodpecker's tree, and they listened at the hole. Down below there was a noise of nut crackers, and a fat squirrel voice and a thin squirrel voice were singing together. "My little old man and I fell out. How shall we bring this matter about? Bring it about as well as you can, and get you gone, you little old man." "You could squeeze in through that little round hole," said Goody Tiptoes. "Yes, I could," said the chipmunk, "but my husband, Chippy Hackee, bites." Down below there was a noise of cracking nuts and nibbling, and then the fat squirrel voice and the thin squirrel voice sang, "For the diddle-um-day, day-diddle-dum-dee, day-diddle-diddle-dum-day." Then Goody peeped in at the hole and called down, "Timmy Tiptoes! Oh, fie, Timmy Tiptoes!" And Timmy replied, "Is that you, Goody Tiptoes? Why, certainly." He came up and kissed Goody through the hole, but he was so fat that he could not get out. Chippy Hackee was not too fat, but he did not want to come. He stayed down below and chuckled. And so it went on for a fortnight, till a big wind blew off the top of the tree and opened up the hole and let in the rain. Then Timmy Tiptoes came out and went home with an umbrella. But Chippy Hackee continued to camp out for another week, although it was uncomfortable. At last a large bear came walking through the wood. Perhaps he also was looking for nuts. He seemed to be sniffing around. Chippy Hackee went home in a hurry. And when Chippy Hackee got home, he found he had caught a cold in his head, and he was more uncomfortable still. And now Timmy and Goody Tiptoes keep their nut store fastened up with a little padlock. And whenever that little bird sees the chipmunks, he sings, "Who's been digging up my nuts? Who's been digging up my nuts?" But nobody ever answers. The End of The Tale of Timmy Tiptoes by Beatrix Potter.
The Cat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cat, Advice to the Young, by Harry Graham, from Ruthless Rhymes for Heartless Homes. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, No. 8. My children, you should imitate the harmless, necessary cat, who eats whatever's on his plate and doesn't even leave the fat, who never stays in bed too late or does immoral things like that. Instead of saying shan't or bosh, he'll sit and wash and wash and wash. When shadows fall and lights grow dim, he sits beneath the kitchen stair. Regardless as to life and limb, a simple couch he chooses there. And if you tumble over him, he simply loves to hear you swear. And while bad language you prefer, he'll sit and purr and purr and purr. End of The Cat by Harry Graham, read by Patrick Wallace.
The Little Red Hen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hunter. The Little Red Hen by Florence White Williams. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection Number 8. A little red hen lived in a barnyard. She spent almost all of her time walking around the barnyard in her pickety-peckety fashion, scratching everywhere for worms. She dearly loved fat, delicious worms, and felt they were absolutely necessary to the health of her children. As often as she found a worm, she would call, "Chuck, chuck, chuck," to her chickies. When they were gathered about her, she would distribute choice morsels of her tidbit. A busy little body was she. A cat usually napped lazily in the barn door, not even bothering herself to scare the rat who ran here and there as he pleased. And as for the pig who lived in the sty, he did not care what happened so long as he could eat and grow fat. One day the little red hen found a seed. It was a wheat seed, but the little red hen was so accustomed to bugs and worms that she supposed this to be some new and perhaps very delicious kind of meat. She bit it gently and found that it resembled a worm in no way whatsoever as to taste, although because it was long and slender. A little red hen might easily be fooled by its appearance. Carrying it about, she made many inquiries as to what it might be. She found it was a wheat seed, and that, if planted, it would grow up, and when ripe it could be made into flour and then into bread. When she discovered that, she knew it ought to be planted. She was so busy hunting food for herself and her family that naturally she thought she ought not to take time to plant it. So she thought of the pig, upon whom time must hang heavily, and of the cat, who had nothing to do, and of the great fat rat, with his idle hours, as she called loudly, "Who will plant the seed?" But the pig said, "Not I," and the cat said, "Not I," and the rat said, "Not I." "Well, then," said the little red hen, "I will." And she did. Then she went on with her daily duties through the long summer days, scratching for worms and feeding her chicks, while the pig grew fat, and the cat grew fat, and the rat grew fat, and the wheat grew tall and ready for harvest. So one day the little red hen chanced to notice how large the wheat was, and that the grain was ripe. So she ran about calling briskly, "Who will cut the wheat?" The pig said, "Not I." The cat said, "Not I." And the rat said, "Not I." "Well, then," said the little red hen, "I will." And she did. She got the sickle from among the farmer's tools in the barn, and proceeded to cut off all of the big plant of wheat. On the ground lay the nicely cut wheat, ready to be gathered and threshed. But the newest and yellowest and downsiest of Mrs. Hen's chicks set up a peep, peep, peeping in their most vigorous fashion, proclaiming to the world at large, but most particularly to their mother, that she was neglecting them. Poor Little Red Hen! She felt quite bewildered, and hardly knew where to turn. Her attention was solely divided between her duty to her children and her duty to the wheat, for which she felt responsible. So again, in a very hopeful tone, she called out, "Who will thresh the wheat?" But the pig, with a grunt, said, "Not I." And the cat, with a meow, said, "Not I." And the rat, with a squeak, said, "Not I." So the Little Red Hen, looking, it must be admitted, rather discouraged, said, "Well, I will then." And she did. Of course, she had to feed her babies first, though, and when she had gotten them all to sleep for their afternoon nap, she went out and threshed the wheat. Then she called out, "Who will carry the wheat to the mill to be ground?" Turning their backs with a snippy glee, that pig said, "Not I." And the cat said, "Not I." And that rat said, "Not I." So the good Little Red Hen could do nothing but say, "I will then." And she did. Carrying the sack of wheat, she trudged off to the distant mill. There she ordered the wheat ground in a beautiful white flour. When the miller brought her the flour, she walked slowly back all the way to her own barnyard, in her own pickety-peckety fashion. She even managed, in spite of her load, to catch a nice juicy worm now and then, and had one left for the babies when she reached them. Those cunning little fluff balls were so glad to see their mother. For the first time they really appreciated her. After this strenuous day, Mrs. Hen retired to her slumbers earlier than usual. Indeed, before the colors came into the sky to herald the setting of the sun, her usual bedtime hour, she would have liked to sleep late in the morning, but her chicks, joining in the morning chorus of the henyard, drove away all hopes of such luxury. Even as she sleepily half opened one eye, the thought came to her that today that wheat must, somehow, be made into bread. She was not in the habit of making bread, although, of course, anyone can make it if he or she follows the recipe with care, and she knew perfectly well that she could do it if necessary. So after her children were fed and made sweet and fresh for the day, she hunted up the pig, the cat, and the rat, still confident that they would surely help her some day. She sang out, "Who will make the bread?" Alas for the Little Red Hen! Once more her hopes were dashed. For the pig said, "Not I." The cat said, "Not I." And the rat said, "Not I." So the Little Red Hen said once more, "I will then." And she did. Feeling that she might have known all the time that she would have to do it all herself, she went to put on a fresh apron and spotless cook's cap. First of all, she set the dough, as was proper. When it was time, she brought out the molding board and baking tins, molded the bread, divided it into loaves, and put them into the oven to bake. All the while the cat sat lazily by, giggling and chuckling, and close at hand the vain rat powdered his nose and admired himself in a mirror. In the distance could be heard the long-drawn snores of the dozing pig. At last the great moment arrived. A delicious odor was wafted upon the autumn breeze. Everywhere the barnyard citizens sniffed the air with delight. The Red Hen ambled in her pickety-peckety way toward the source of all this excitement. Although she appeared to be perfectly calm, in reality she could only with difficulty restrain an impulse to dance and sing, for had she not done all the work on this wonderful bread? Small wonder that she was the most excited person in the barnyard. She did not know whether the bread would be fit to eat, but joy of joys, when the lovely brown loaves came out of the oven, they were done to perfection. Then, probably because she had acquired the habit, the red hen called, "Who will eat the bread?" All the animals in the barnyard were watching hungrily and smacking their lips in anticipation. The pig said, "I will." The cat said, "I will." And the rat said, "I will." But the little red hen said, "No, you won't. I will." And she did. End of The Little Red Hen by Florence White Williams. Read by Hunter.
The Story of a Seal. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. The Story of a Seal by Anonymous. From Chatterbox Stories of Natural History. Some years ago, a German artist was traveling in Norway on foot with his knapsack on his back and his stick in his hand. He lodged most of the time in the cottages that he fell in with on his road. In one of them there was a seal, which the fisherman had found on the sand, after harpooning the mother of the poor animal. No sooner was it admitted into the cottage than the seal became the friend of the family, and the playmate of the children. It played from morning till night with them, would lick their hands, and call them with a gentle little cry, which is not unlike the human voice, and it would look at them tenderly, with its large blue eyes, shaded by long black lashes. It almost always followed its master to fish, swimming around the boat, and taking a great many fish, which it delivered to the fishermen without even giving them a bite. A dog could not have been more devoted, faithful, teachable, nor even more intelligent. End of The Story of a Seal by Anonymous. Read by TechSavvy. www.techsavvy.wordpress.com.
Too Clever by Half. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claudia Salto. Too Clever by Half by E. Nesbitt from Pussy and Doggy Tales, LibriVox Coffee Break Collection number 8. "Tell us a story, Mother," said the youngest kitten but 3. "You've heard all my stories," said the mother cat, sleepily turning over in the hay. "Then make a new one," said the youngest kitten, so pertly that Mrs. Buff boxed her ears at once, but she laughed too. Did you ever hear a cat laugh? People say that cats often have occasion to do it. "I do know one story," she said, "but I'm not sure that it's true, though it was told me by a most respectable brindled gentleman, a great friend of my dear mother's. He said he was a second cousin 29 times removed of Mrs. Tabby White, the lady the story is about." "Oh, do tell it," said all the kittens, sitting up very straight and looking at their mother with green, anxious eyes. "Very well," she said kindly, "only if you interrupt I shall leave off." So there was silence in the barn, except for Mrs. Buff's voice and the soft sound of pleased purring which the kittens made as they listened to the enchanting tale. Mrs. Tabby White seems to have been as clever a cat as ever went rat-catching in a pair of soft-soled shoes. She always knew just where a mouse would peep out of the wainscot, and she had her soft, sharp paw on him before he had time to know that he was not alone in the room. She knew how to catch nice breakfasts for herself and her children, a trick I will teach you, my dears, when the spring comes. She used to lie quite quietly among the ivy on the wall, and then take the baby birds out of the nest when the grown-up birds had gone to the grub shop. Mrs. Tabby White was very clever, as I said, so clever that presently she was not satisfied with being at the very top of the cat profession. Cat people have more sense than human people, of course, she said to herself, but still there are some things one might learn from them. I must watch and see how they do things. So next morning, when the cook gave Mrs. Tabby White her breakfast, she noticed that cook poured the milk out of a jug into a saucer. That afternoon Tabby felt thirsty, but instead of putting her head into the jug and drinking in the usual way, you know, she tilted up the jug to pour the milk out as she had seen the cook do. But cats' paws, though they are so strong to catch rats and mice and birds, are too weak to hold big brown jugs. The nasty, deceitful jug fell off the dresser and broke itself. "Just to spite me, I do believe," said Mrs. Tabby, and the milk was spilled. "Now how on earth could that jug have been broken?" said cook when she came in. "It must have been the cat," said the kitchen maid, and she was quite right, but nobody believed her. Then Mrs. Tabby White noticed that human people slept in big, soft-cushioned white beds, instead of sleeping on the kitchen hearth-rug or in the barn like cat people. So she said to her children one evening, "My dears, we are going to move into a new house." And the kittens were delighted, and they all went upstairs very quietly and crept into the very best human bed. But unfortunately that bed had been got ready for a human uncle to sleep in, and when he found the cats there he turned them out, not gently, and threw boots at them till they fled, pale with fright to the ends of their pretty tails. And next morning he told the mistress of the house that horrid cats had been in his bed, and he vowed that he would never pass another night under a roof where such things were possible. Mrs. Tabby White was very glad, because no lady can wish for the visits of a person who throws boots at her. But the mistress of the house said sadly, "Oh, Tabby, you have lost us a fortune." And Tabby, for all her cleverness, didn't understand what the mistress meant, but went on purring proudly and wondering what clever thing she could do next. And I don't know what it meant either, so don't you interrupt with silly questions. "I think we ought to wear shoes," was the next thing Mrs. Tabby White said, but all the human shoes were too big for her. However, there was a nice pair of salmon-colored kids' shoes, quite new, belonging to the human child's big doll, and Mrs. Tabby White put them on her eldest kitten's little brownie feet. "Now, Brindle," she said, he was named after the gentleman who told me the story, "you are grander than any kitten ever was before." And at first Brindle felt pleased, Then he tried to feel pleased, then he knew he wasn't pleased at all. Then the shoes began to hurt him horribly, so he mewed sadly, and Mrs. Tabby White boxed his ears softly, as mother cats do. You know how I mean. But when she was asleep, he took off the pink shoes and bit them to pieces. And nurse slapped him for it. Poor Mrs. Tabby White was very miserable when she saw her son being slapped, for it is one thing to box your son's ears softly, as mother cats do, you know how I mean, and quite another to see another person do it heavily, as is the way with nursemaids. But the last and greatest effort Mrs. Tabby White made to imitate human manners was one Saturday night. She saw the human child have its bath before the nursery fire, with hot water, pink soap, dry towels, and much fussing, and she said to herself, "Why should I waste hours every day in washing my children with my little white paws and my little pink tongue, when this human child can be made clean in 10 minutes with this big bath? If I had more time, I could learn to be cleverer, and I should end by being the most wonderful cat in all the world." So she sat and watched and waited. When the human child was in bed and asleep, nurse went down to her supper, leaving the bath to be cleared away later, for it was a hot supper of baked onions and toasted cheese, and if you don't go to that supper directly it is ready, you may as well not go at all, for it won't be worth eating, at least so I have heard the kitchen maid say. Mrs. Tabby White waited till she heard the last of nurse's steps on the stairs below, and then she put both her cat children into the tub and washed them with rose-scented soap and a turkey sponge. At first they thought it very good fun, but presently the soap got in their eyes, and they were frightened of the sponge, and they cried, mewing piteously, to be taken out. I don't know how she could have done it. I couldn't have treated a kitten of mine like that. When she took them out, Mrs. Tabby tried to dry them with a soft towel, but somehow cat skin is not so easy to dry as child skin, and the little cats began to shiver and moan, "Oh, mother, we were so nice and warm, and now we are so cold. Why is it? What have we done? Were we naughty?" "Drat the cats," said nurse when she came up from supper and found Mrs. Tabby White trying to warm her kittens against her own comfortable fur, "if they haven't tumbled in the bath." Nurse dried the poor, dear, cruelly used kittens a little. Her hands were bigger than Mrs. Tabby's, so she could do it better, and put them in a basket with flannel, and next day Tabby Kit was quite well, though rather ragged looking, but Brindle had taken a chill, and for days he hung between life and death. Poor Mrs. Tabby was like a wild cat with anxiety, and when at last Brindle was well again, or nearly, for he always had a slight cough after that, Mrs. Tabby White said to her children, "My darlings, I was wrong. I was a silly old cat." "No," purred the cat children, "darling mother, you were always the best of cats." Mrs. Tabby kissed them both, for of course anyone would be pleased that her children should think her the best of cats, but in her heart she knew well enough how silly she had been. Then she set about washing the kittens, not with pink soap and white towels this time, but with white paws and a pink tongue in the good old-fashioned way. "Thank you, mother," said all the kittens. "What a nice, horrible story!" "What is the moral?" asked the youngest kitten but 3. "The moral," said Mrs. Buffy, "is, there is such a thing as being too clever by half. I'm not sure about the story being true, but I know the moral is. Why, it's nearly tea time. Come along, children, and get your tea." So they all crept quietly away to catch the necessary mice, and the youngest was so afraid of being too clever by half that she would never have caught a mouse at all if her mother had not boxed her ears, softly as mother cats do. You know how I mean. End of Too Clever by Half by E. Nesbit.
Why Hooty the Owl Does Not Play on the Green Meadows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Why Hooty the Owl Does Not Play on the Green Meadows by Thornton W. Burgess. From Mother West Wind's Children. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, number 8. The Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind were having a good night game of tag down on the Green Meadows. They were having such a jolly time while they waited for Old Mother West Wind and her big bag to take them to their home behind the Purple Hills. Jolly, round, red Mr. Sun had already put his nightcap on. Black shadows crept softly out from the Purple Hills onto the Green Meadows. The Merry Little Breezes grew sleepy, almost too sleepy to play, for Old Mother West Wind was very, very late. Farther and farther and farther out onto the Green Meadows crept the black shadows. Suddenly one seemed to separate from the others. Softly, oh so softly, yet swiftly, it floated towards the Merry Little Breezes. One of them happened to look up and saw it coming. It was the same Little Breeze who one time stayed out all night. When he looked up and saw this seeming shadow moving so swiftly, he knew that it was no shadow at all. "Here comes Hooty the Owl," cried the Little Breeze. Then all the Merry Little Breezes stopped their game of tag to look at Hooty the Owl. It is seldom they have a chance to see him, for usually Hooty the Owl does not come out on the Green Meadows until after the Merry Little Breezes are snugly tucked in bed behind the Purple Hills. "Perhaps Hooty the Owl will tell us why it is that he never comes out to play with us," said one of the Little Breezes. But just as Hooty the Owl floated over to them, up came Old Mother West Wind, and she was in a great hurry, for she was late, and she was tired. She had had a busy day, a very busy day indeed, hunting for a rain cloud which had gone astray. So now she just opened her big bag and tumbled all the Merry Little Breezes into it as fast as she could, without giving them so much as a chance to say good evening to Hooty the Owl. Then she took them off home behind the Purple Hills. Of course the Merry Little Breezes were disappointed, very much disappointed, but they were also very sleepy, for they had played hard all day. "Never mind," said one of them drowsily. "Tomorrow we'll ask Great-Grandfather Frog why it is that Hooty the Owl never comes out to play with us on the Green Meadows. He'll know." The next morning Old Mother West Wind was late in coming down from the Purple Hills. When she finally did turn the Merry Little Breezes out of her bag onto the Green Meadows, jolly, round, red Mr. Sun was already quite high in the blue sky. The Merry Little Breezes waited just long enough to say good-bye to Old Mother West Wind, and then started a mad race to see who could reach the Smiling Pool first. There they found Great-Grandfather Frog sitting on his big green lily pad as usual. He was very contented with the world, was Grandfather Frog, for fat green flies had been more foolish than usual that morning, and already he had all that he could safely tuck inside his white and yellow waistcoat. "Good morning, Grandfather Frog," shouted the Merry Little Breezes. "Will you tell us why it is that Hooty the Owl never comes out to play with us on the Green Meadows?" "Chug-a-rum," said Great-Grandfather Frog gruffly. "How should I know?" You see, Grandfather Frog likes to be teased a little. "But oh, you do know, for you are so old and so very wise," cried the Merry Little Breezes all together. Grandfather Frog smiled, for he likes to be thought very wise, and also he was feeling very good indeed that morning. "Chug-a-rum!" said Grandfather Frog. "If you sit perfectly still, I'll tell you what I know about Hooty the Owl. But remember, you must sit perfectly still, per-fect-ly still." The Merry Little Breezes sighed, for it is the hardest thing in the world for them to keep perfectly still unless they are asleep. But they promised that they would, and when they had settled down, each one in the heart of a great white water lily, Grandfather Frog began. "Once upon a time, when the world was young, Hooty the Owl's grandfather, 1,000 times removed, used to fly about in daylight with the other birds. He was very big and very strong and very fierce, was Mr. Owl. He had great big claws and a hooked bill, just as Hooty the Owl has now, and he was afraid of nothing and nobody. Now when people are very big and very strong and afraid of nothing and nobody, they are very apt to care for nothing and nobody but themselves. So it was with Mr. Owl. Whatever he saw that he wanted, he took, no matter to whom it belonged, for there was no one to stop him. As I have already told you, Mr. Owl was very big and very strong and very fierce, and he was a very great glutton. It took a great many little birds and little animals to satisfy his appetite. But he didn't stop there. No, sir, he didn't stop there. He used to kill harmless little meadow people just for the fun of killing, and because he could. Every day he grew more savage. Finally, no one smaller than himself dared stir on the Green Meadows when he was around. The little birds no longer sang. The field mice children no longer played among the meadow grasses. Those were sad days, very sad days indeed, on the Green Meadows, said Grandfather Frog with a sigh. At last Old Mother Nature came to visit the Green Meadows, and she soon saw what a terrible state things were in. No one came to meet her, for you see no one dared to show himself for fear of fierce old Mr. Owl. Now I have told you that Mr. Owl was afraid of nothing and nobody, but this was not quite true, for he was afraid, very much afraid, of Old Mother Nature. When he saw her coming, he was sitting on top of a tall dead stump, and he at once tried to look very meek and very innocent. Old Mother Nature wasted no time. "Where are all my little meadow people, and why do they not come to give me greeting?" demanded Old Mother Nature of Mr. Owl. Mr. Owl bowed very low. "I'm sure I don't know. I think they must all be taking a nap," said he. Now you can't fool Old Mother Nature, and it's of no use to try. No, sir, you can't fool Old Mother Nature. She just looked at Mr. Owl, and she looked at the feathers and fur scattered about the foot of the dead stump. Mr. Owl stood first on one foot and then on the other. He tried to look Old Mother Nature in the face, but he couldn't. You see, Mr. Owl had a guilty conscience, and a guilty conscience never looks anyone straight in the face. He did wish that Mother Nature would say something, did Mr. Owl, but she didn't. She just looked and looked and looked and looked straight at Mr. Owl. The longer she looked, the uneasier he got, and the faster he shifted from one foot to the other. Finally he shifted so fast that he seemed to be dancing on top of the old stump. Gradually, a few at a time, the little meadow people crept out from their hiding places and formed a great circle around the old dead stump. With Old Mother Nature there, they felt sure that no harm could come to them. Then they began to laugh at the funny sight of fierce old Mr. Owl hopping from one foot to the other on top of the old dead stump. It was the first laugh on the Green Meadows for a long, long, long time. Of course Mr. Owl saw them laughing at him, but he could think of nothing but the sharp eyes of Old Mother Nature boring straight through him, and he danced faster than ever. The faster he danced, the funnier he looked, and the funnier he looked, the harder the little meadow people laughed. Finally Old Mother Nature slowly raised a hand and pointed a long forefinger at Mr. Owl. All the little meadow people stopped laughing to hear what she would say. "Mr. Owl," she began, "I know and you know why none of my little meadow people were here to give me a greeting. And this shall be your punishment. From now on your eyes shall become so tender that they cannot stand the light of day, so that hereafter you shall fly about only after round red Mr. Sun has gone to bed behind the purple hills. No more shall my little people who play on the green meadows all day long have cause to fear you, for no more shall you see to do them harm." When she ceased speaking, all the little meadow people gave a great shout, for they knew that it would be even as Mother Nature had said. Then began such a frolic as the Green Meadows had not known for many a long day. But Mr. Owl flew slowly and with difficulty over the darkest part of the deep wood, for the light hurt his eyes dreadfully, and he could hardly see. And as he flew, the little birds flew around him in a great cloud, and plucked out his feathers, and tormented him, for he could not see to harm them. Grandfather Frog paused and looked dreamily across the Smiling Pool. Suddenly he opened his big mouth, and then closed it with a snap. One more foolish green fly had disappeared inside the white and yellow waistcoat. "Chug-a-rum!" said Grandfather Frog. "Those were sad days indeed for Mr. Owl. He couldn't hunt for his meals by day, for the light blinded him. At night he could see but little in the darkness, so he got little to eat, and he grew thinner and thinner and thinner, until he was but a shadow of his former self. He was always hungry, was Mr. Owl, always hungry. No one was afraid of him now, for it was the easiest thing in the world to keep out of his way. At last old Mother Nature came again to visit the Green Meadows and the Green Forest. Far, far in the darkest part of the deep wood she found Mr. Owl. When she saw how very thin and how very, very miserable he was, her heart was moved to pity, for old Mother Nature loves all her subjects, even the worst of them. All the fierceness was gone from Mr. Owl. He was so weak that he just sat huddled in the thickest part of the great pine. You see, he had been able to catch very little to eat. "Mr. Owl," said Mother Nature gently, "you now know something of the misery and the suffering which you have caused others, and I think you have been punished enough. No more may you fly abroad over the Green Meadows while the day is bright, for still is the fear of you in the hearts of all my little meadow people. But hereafter you shall not find it so difficult to get enough to eat. Your eyes shall grow big, bigger than the eyes of any other bird, so that you shall be able to see in the dusk and even in the dark. Your ears shall grow large, larger than the ears of any of the little forest or meadow people, so that you can hear the very least sound. Your feathers shall become as soft as down, so that when you fly none shall hear you." And from that day it was even so. Mr. Owl's eyes grew big and bigger, until he could see as well in the dusk as he used to see in the full light of day. His ears grew large and larger, until his hearing became so keen that he could hear the least rustle, even at a long distance. And when he flew he made no sound, but floated like a great shadow. The little meadow people no longer feared him by day, but when the shadows began to creep out from the purple hills each night, and they heard his voice, "Woot-to-woo-hoo-woo," they felt all the old fear of him. If they were wise, they did not stir, but if they were foolish and so much as shivered, Mr. Owl was sure to hear them and silently pounce upon them. So once more Mr. Owl grew strong and fierce, but only at night had anyone cause to fear him, and then only the foolish and timid. "And now you know," concluded Grandfather Frog, "why it is that Hooty the Owl never comes out to play with you on the Green Meadows, and why his eyes are so big and his ears so large." Thank you, Grandfather Frog!" cried the Merry Little Breezes, springing up from the white water lilies and stretching themselves. "We'll bring you the first foolish green fly we can find." Then away they rushed to hunt for it. End of Why Hooty the Owl Does Not Play on the Green Meadows, by Thornton W. Burgess.
Zig Zag Ophidian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Chestnut. Zig Zag Ophidian by Arthur Morrison and J. A. Shepard from the Strand Magazine, April 1893. LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, number 8. There is a certain coolness, almost to be called a positive want of cordiality, between snakes and human beings. More, the snake is never a social favorite among the animals called lower. Nobody makes an intimate friend of a snake. Popular natural history books are filled and running over with anecdotes of varying elegance and mendacity, setting forth extraordinary cases of affection and cooperation between a cat and a mouse, a horse and a hen, a pig and a cockroach, a camel and a lobster, a cow and a wheelbarrow, and so on. But there is never a snake in one of these quaint alliances. Snakes do not do that sort of thing, and the anecdote designer's imagination has not yet risen to the feat of compelling them, although the stimulus of competition may soon cause it. The case most nearly approaching one of friendship between man and snake known to me is the case of Tyrrell, the zoo snake-keeper, and his Laidly worms. But then the friendship is mostly on Tyrrell's side, and moreover, Tyrrell is rather more than human, as anyone will admit who sees him hang boa constrictors round his neck. Of course, one often hears of boys making pets of common English snakes, but a boy is not a human creature at all. He is a kind of harpy. The prairie marmot and the burrowing owl come into neighborly contact with the rattlesnake, but the acquaintance does not quite amount to friendship. The prairie marmot takes a lot of trouble and builds a nice burrow, and then the owl, who is only a slovenly sort of architect himself, comes along and takes apartments. It has never been quite settled whether or not the lodger and the landlord agree pleasantly together, but in the absence of any positive evidence they may be given credit for perfect amiability, because nobody has found traces of owl in a dead marmot's interior, nor of marmot in an owl's. But the rattlesnake is another thing. He waits till the residence has been made perfectly comfortable, and then comes in himself, not in the friendly capacity of a lodger, but as sort of an unholy ritter, a scaly man in possession. He eats the marmot's family, and perhaps the marmot himself, curling himself up comfortably in the best part of the drawing-room. The owl and his belongings he leaves severely alone, but whether from a doubt as to the legality of distraining upon the goods of a lodger, or from a certainty as to the lodger's goods, including claws and a beak, naturalists do not say. Personally, I incline very much to the claw and beak theory, having seen an owl kill a snake in a very neat and workmanlike manner, and indeed the rattlesnake sometimes catches a tartar even in the marmot. It isn't terror of the snake that makes him unpopular. The most harmless snake never acquires the confidence of other creatures, and one hesitates to carry it in his hat. This general repugnance is something like backing a bill or paying a tailor, entirely a matter of form. Nothing else has sympathy with the serpent's shape. When any other animal barters away his legs, he buys either fins or wings with them. This is a generally understood law, invariably respected. But the snake goes in for extravagance in ribs and vertebrae, an eccentric, rakish, and improper proceeding, part of an irregular and raffish life. Nothing can carry within it affection or even respect for an animal whose tail begins nowhere in particular, unless it is at the neck, even if any creature may esteem it an animal at all that is but a tail with the mouth and eyes at one end. Dignify the mouth and eyes into a head, and you still have nothing wherewith to refute those who shall call the snake tribe naught but heads and tails, a vulgar and raffish condition of life, of pothouse and Tommy Dodd suggestion. And this is why nothing loves a snake. It is not because the snake is feared, but because it is incomprehensible. The talk of its upas-like influence, its deadly fascination, is chiefly picturesque humbug. Ducks will approach a snake curiously, inwardly debating the possibility of digesting so big a worm at one meal. The moving tail tip they will peck at cheerfully. This was the sort of thing that one might have observed for himself years ago here at the zoo, at the time when the snakes lived in the old house in blankets because of the unsteadiness of the thermometer, and were fed in public. Now the snakes are fed in strict privacy, lest the sight overset the morals of visitors. The killing of a bird, a rabbit, or a rat by a snake being almost a quarter as unpleasant to look upon as the killing of the same animal by a man in a farmyard or elsewhere. The abject terror inspired by the presence of a snake is such that an innocent rat will set to gnawing the snake's tail in default of more usual provender, while a rabbit placed with a snake near skin-shedding time will placidly nibble on the loose rags of epidermis about the snake's side. The pig treats a snake with disrespect, not to say insolence. Nothing, Ophidian or otherwise, can fascinate a pig. If your back garden is infested with rattlesnakes, you should keep pigs. The pig dances contemptuously on the rattlesnake and eats him with much relish, rattles and all. The last emotion of the rattlesnake is intense astonishment, and astonishment is natural in the circumstances. A respectable and experienced rattlesnake, many years established in business, has been accustomed to spread panic everywhere within ear and eye shot. Everything capable of motion has started off at the faintest rustle of his rattles, and his view of animal life from those expressionless eyes has invariably been a back view, and a rapidly diminishing one. After a lifelong experience of this sort, to be unceremoniously rushed upon by a common pig, to be jumped upon, to be flouted and snouted, to be treated as so much swill, and finally to be made a snack of, this causes a feeling of very natural and painful surprise in the rattlesnake. But a rattlesnake is only surprised in this way once, and he is said to improve the pork. As a tour de force in the gentle art of lying, the snake story is justly esteemed. All the records in this particular branch of sport are held in the United States of America, where proficiency at snakes is the first qualification of a descriptive reporter. The old story of the two snakes swallowing each other from the tail till both disappeared, the story of the snake that took its own tail in its mouth and trundled after its victim like a hoop, the story of the man who chopped a snake in half just as it was bolting a rat, so that the rat merely toddled through the foremost half and escaped, all of these have been beaten out of sight in America. At present, Brazil claims the record for absolute length of the snakes themselves, but the Yankee snake story man will soon claim that record too. He will explain that each state pays a reward for every snake killed within its own limits, but that there are always disputes between the different states as to payment, because most of the snakes killed are rather large, crawling across several states at once. Here, among a number of viperine snakes of about the same size, is a snake that lives on eggs. He is about as thick as a lead pencil, but that doesn't prevent him swallowing a large pigeon's egg whole, nor even a hen's egg at a pinch. It dislocates his jaw, but that is part of his professional system, and when the business is over, he calmly joints up his jaw again and goes to sleep. He is eccentric, even for a snake, and wears his teeth on his backbone, where they may break the eggshell, so that he may spit it away. When he first stretched his head round an egg, the viperine snakes in the same case hastily assumed him to be a very large tadpole, and since tadpoles are regarded with gastronomical affection by viperine snakes, they began an instant chase, each prepared to swallow the entire phenomenon, because a snake never hesitates to swallow anything merely on account of its size. When finally the egg swallower broke the egg and presented to their gaze the crumpled shell, the perplexed viperines subsided and retired to remote corners of the case to think the matter over and forget it, like the crowd dispersed by the circulating hat of the street conjurer. Familiarity with the snake breeds toleration. He is a lawless sort of creature, certainly with too many vertebrae and no eyelids, but he is not always so horrible as he is imagined. A snake is rather a pleasant thing to handle than otherwise. Warm, firm, dry, hard and smooth on the scales, rather like ivory to the touch. He is also a deal heavier than you expect. When, for good behavior, I have been admitted to Tyrrell's inner sanctum here, and to the corridors behind the lairs, where hang cast skins like stockings on a line, I have handled many of his pets. I have never got quite as far as rattlesnakes, because rattlesnakes have a blackguardly, welshing look that I don't approve. But there is a Robben Island snake about 5 feet long with no poison, who is very pleasant company. It is a pity that these snakes have no pet names. I would suggest the pirate as a suitable name for any snake from Robben Island. For anyone who has been bitten by a cobra, or a rattlesnake, or a puff adder, there are many remedies, but few people who can recommend them from personal experience. It is to be feared that most of them unfortunately die before writing their testimonials. Perhaps they were too long deciding which thing to take. The most famous of these remedies, and probably the best on the whole, is to get excessively drunk. It is expensive to get drunk after a poisonous snake bite, because something in the veins fortify the head against the first bottle or two of whiskey. Getting drunk before the bite won't do, although there would appear to be very widely prevalent impression that it will, and a very common resolve to lay up a good store of cure against possible accidents in the future. This may be misdirected prudence, and nothing else, but there is often a difficulty in persuading a magistrate to think so. The snake will be eccentric, even in the matter of its eggs. Most snakes secure originality and independence in this matter by laying eggs like an elongated tennis ball, eggs covered with a sort of white parchment or leather instead of shell. All the rest go further and refuse to lay eggs at all. The snake insists on having his food fresh. You must let him do his own killing. Many carry this sort of fastidiousness so far as to prefer taking it in alive and leaving it to settle matters with the digestive machinery as best it may. A snake of this sort has lost his dinner before now by gaping too soon. A frog takes a deal of swallowing before he forgets how to jump. It is well to remember what to do in case of attack by a formidable snake. If a boa constrictor or a python begin to curl himself about you, you should pinch him vigorously, and he will loosen his folds and get away from you. Some may prefer to blow his head off with a pistol, but it is largely a matter of taste, and one doesn't want to damage a good specimen. The anaconda, however, who is the biggest of the constrictors, won't let go for pinching. In this case, the best thing is not to let him get hold of you at all. Tobacco juice will kill a puff adder. If you come across a puff adder, you should open his mouth gently, remembering that the scratch of a fang means death in half an hour or so, and give him the tobacco juice in a suitable dose. Or you can run away as fast as possible, which is kinder to the snake and much healthier for yourself. By far the biggest snake here is the python, in the case opposite the door. He is more than 20 feet long, and is seriously thinking of growing longer still. Tyrrell picks him up unceremoniously by the neck, and shoves him head first into a tank of water when he seems to need a little stir and amusement. I think, perhaps after all, the most remarkable thing being exhibited in the reptile house is Tyrrell. I don't think much of the Indian snake charmers now. See a cobra raise his head and flatten out its neck till it looks like a demoniac flounder set on end. Keep in mind that a bite means death in a few minutes. Presently you will feel yourself possessed with a certain respect for a snake charmer who tootles on a flute while the thing crawls about him. But Tyrrell comes along without a flute, without as much as a jew's harp, and carelessly grabs that cobra by the neck and strolls off with it wherever he thinks it ought to go, and you believe in European after all. He is a most enthusiastic naturalist, is Tyrrell. He thinks nothing of festooning a boa constrictor about his neck and arms, and in his sanctum he keeps young crocodiles in sundry watering pots and other crawling things in unexpected places. You never quite know where the next surprise is coming from. I always feel doubtful about his pockets. I shouldn't recommend a pickpocket to try them unless he really doesn't mind running up against a casual rattlesnake. Tyrrell is the sort of man who is quite likely to produce something from his cap and say, "By the by, this is a promising youngster, Death Adder, you know, and here," taking something else from his coat or vest pocket, "is a very fine specimen of the spotted coffin filler. Rather curious. It isn't very poisonous. Kills in under an hour or so. Now this," dragging another from somewhere under his coat, "is rather poisonous. Deadly graveworm. Kills in 3 seconds. Lovely little chap, isn't he? Feel his head." Whereat you would probably move on. End of Zig Zag Ophidian by Arthur Morrison and J. A. Shepard, read by Jeff Chestnut.